Ink and ruin at Hartcombe. By the time I untied the fourth packet in the late Countess's morning room, my fingers were gray with dust and sealing wax. Condolences. One receipted annuity list. Then a letter I knew before I fully saw it because the hand was mine. Not the hand I used now. The hand of a hungry widow paid to copy what she was not meant to read. The door opened behind me. Mrs. Bryce said, "His lordship is coming up." Chapter 1. The Hand in Brown Ink. I had not expected grief to make such a disorder. The late Countess of Westmore had been, by all accounts, a woman of rural habit and excellent locks. Yet her morning room looked as though her death had loosened every ribbon in the house. Bills lay pressed beneath cards of condolence. A neat stack of almanacs stood beside an open dispatch box with no key in sight. 3 ledgers had been moved from the escritoire to a side table and left there, not by a thief, I thought, but by a person who had lost courage halfway through an unpleasant duty. That last sort of disorder was the commoner kind. I knew it too well. I set the tied packet back upon the blotter and flattened my hand over it a moment longer than was wise. Dust clung to my fingertips. The paper beneath my palm did not alter. It remained what it had been when I first saw the hand upon the front. Dangerous. My own. Mrs. Vale. A Mrs. Bryce stood at the threshold with a tray on one arm and a look upon her face which said she did not approve of cold tea, loose papers, or widows who had not yet the sense to be intimidated by great houses. She was the housekeeper and wore her authority like a clean apron plain, hard to fault and never for ornament. "I beg your pardon," I said, lifting my hand from the packet. "I did not hear you." "No, ma'am." She crossed the room with careful steps that somehow still managed reproach. "I dare say you did not. You have been at those papers since 8. 8:30. She set the tray down with more precision than warmth. "Tea. Bread gone dry at the edges. A dish of butter. His lordship is coming up." The room seemed to contract, though the windows were high and the ceiling higher. Outside, rain had begun again, not in a dramatic manner but with the steady insistence of Derbyshire weather that means to be remembered by one's bones. It touched the panes in a fine grey stitching. The fire, though laid, burnt low. Somewhere below stairs a door shut. House sounds, service sounds, the sounds a woman notices when she has lived too long by listening for what might alter her place in a room. I slipped my thumb beneath the top sheet of the packet and found there the smaller loose paper I had seen a moment before, a narrow schedule slip half hidden beneath the copied letter. Dates. Initials, 3 payment columns, not charity then, or not charity only. I folded the slip once and drew it into my sleeve while Mrs. Bryce poured the tea. The motion was slight. Even so, I felt it in my throat. Mrs. Bryce turned at the sound of porcelain touching porcelain. Her eyes passed over me, my cuffs, the escritoire, the tied bundles, the open cabinet beyond. If she saw anything amiss, she gave no sign of it, but that did not reassure me. A capable housekeeper notices first and speaks later. "He does not like delay," she said. "No one who inherits debt ever does." That made her look at me properly. I ought perhaps to have softened the remark. Instead, I reached for the tea. It had gone too strong. I drank it anyway. It was hot enough to steady me a little. Mrs. Bryce adjusted the angle of the butter dish by an unnecessary inch. "His lordship has not discussed family matters with me." "Of course not." "Nor with the servants." That earned her from me a brief glance. There are statements and there are denials. This was the second sort and therefore more useful. She met my eyes without flinching. "I only mean, that Hartcombe has had strangers in and out these past weeks. Solicitors, valuers, clerks. A gentleman from Matlock who smelled of damp leather and asked after silver as though the family plate had insulted him personally. The house has no wish for more confusion. No house ever does." I set the cup down. My hand was steady now. I had trained myself into such steadiness after my husband died, because tradesmen, landlords, and pitting acquaintances all grow bolder if they see a trimmer. A woman alone must keep her fingers under command, even when her thoughts are not. Mrs. Bryce glanced toward the packet on the desk. The ribbon I had untied lay beside it. Brown ordinary, too ordinary for what it bound. What owes there something of use in that bundles? Here it was. Not accusation, not curiosity. Something older and sharper than either. A house asking whether I belonged to its danger. "Possibly," I said. "I should prefer to compare it first against the annuity book and the correspondence from the blue cabinet. The blue cabinet is empty. It was not empty yesterday." "No more." Mr. Pike removed 2 sets of household receipts before breakfast. "On whose authority?" "His lordship's, I believe." I kept my face composed, though inwardly I corrected the note at once. Not merely disorder then. Selection removal. Someone had begun making the papers fit a more convenient shape. "I see." See, Mrs. Bryce did not move. "Will you be wanting the key to the Countess's writing drawer?" My heart gave one hard stroke. I had not asked for it, not aloud. "If it may be had." "It may be had," she said. "Though whether it should is another matter." There was very little one may safely say to a housekeeper who has kept one family's secrets longer than one has kept one's own gloves. Agreement can sound like weakness. Defiance can sound like guilt. I chose the truth nearest to usefulness. I was engaged to put the papers in order, I said. I cannot do it from the threshold. No. Her expression altered by the smallest degree. I suppose not. She drew a key from the pocket concealed in her skirts and placed it beside the tea tray, not beside me. A distinction. She had not yielded it to me so much as allowed it to exist in my vicinity. His lordship will not thank you, she said. If this work takes longer than he expects. Men in haste seldom thank the person who tells them which figures are real. At that, something almost like approval touched the corner of her mouth and was gone. Then perhaps, she said, you and his lordship are well matched in temper. Before I could answer, steps sounded in the corridor outside. Not hurried, not idle. A man who had learned command young and found it heavier than he liked. Mrs. Bryce picked up the tray. I rose. My chair gave the faintest scrape against the carpet. The packet with my copied letter still lay open on the desk. The schedule slip rested hot and thin against my arm inside the sleeve of my gown. On the far side of the room, rain pressed softly at the windows as though the house and the weather had agreed between them to keep every soul inside under judgment. The steps came nearer. Mrs. Bryce moved to the door, then paused beside me. One warning, Mrs. Val. I turned my head. He is not his aunt, she said. If you mean to deceive him, do not do it badly. Then she opened the door. The new Earl of Westmore filled the doorway without seeming to try. He was not a large man in the blunt fashion of boxers and blacksmiths, yet the room altered around him all the same. Perhaps because he stood as though he expected resistance and had already weighed whether it was worth the trouble. Perhaps because he wore mourning that had been cut by a very good tailor and looked as if he had forgotten it was upon him. Or perhaps because, unlike most gentlemen who entered rooms where women worked, he did not glance first at my face. He looked at the desk, at the untied packets, the ledgers, the blue cabinet standing open, the tray Mrs. Bryce had just carried away, then, at last, at me, Mrs. Vale, Lord Westmore. His gaze rested on me one measured second longer than politeness required. He had very clear eyes. Gray, I thought at first, until he turned his head slightly and the rainlight found some darker edge in them. They were not soft eyes, nor were they cruel. I had seen cruel eyes. Cruel eyes hurry when they discover weakness. These did not hurry at all. Mrs. Bryce withdrew and shut the door behind him. He came no farther into the room. I am told you have asked for my aunt's writing drawer. I have not asked for it. Mrs. Bryce was kind enough to mention it. That sounds very like asking for it. There was no point in pretending not to hear the rebuke tucked into the sentence. Then perhaps, I said, your lordship had rather I work only on what has already been selected for me. He did not answer at once. That told me enough. So Mr. Pike had been in the room before me, or some other useful gentleman with clean hands and a fondness for narrowing facts. It was remarkable how often men called a thing orderly after they had removed what most inconvenienced them. Lord Westmore crossed to the fireplace and stood with one hand on the mantel, not seeking warmth but position. He was younger than I had expected. Not a boy, certainly, yet not old enough to have spent years learning how estates die by degrees. 30, perhaps. A little more. Dark hair cut with sense rather than vanity. A face that would have been handsome had it not been set, just then, in the particular stillness of a man who had been receiving unwelcome accounts for weeks and found each new one less surprising than the last. I had rather, he said, that this work proceed quickly. Quickly and correctly are not always close companions. They must become so at Hartcombe. Is the house to be opened? He watched me. I watched him back. There is a kind of silence that belongs to strangers and another that belongs to people who have immediately recognized each other as obstacles. This was at some point, he said. There are matters to settle. Sales, I said. He gave the smallest movement of one shoulder. Valuation first. That is only a sale with better manners. His mouth did not quite smile. Mrs. Vale, I have not come up here to debate definitions. No, I said. You have come to hasten me. I have come to know whether I am paying for speed or for curiosity. That was better. An honest sentence at last. I moved around the desk so that the packet with the copied letter lay behind my body rather than beneath his eye. You are paying for order. If you prefer a clerk, you may have a clerk. If you prefer the truth of your aunt's papers, that is slower work. He said nothing. I went on because one has survived widowed vicarages and landlords with damp in the walls. One loses some instinct for trembling before titles. I was engaged because ladies with drawers full of correspondence do not usually leave behind only household bills and devotional tracts. They leave promises, quiet arrangements, family embarrassments, things paid for twice, things never paid for at all. If your lordship wishes merely to know how many candlesticks there are, I am extravagantly overqualified. That did it. A line appeared for an instant between his brows, not of anger, I thought, but of the fatigue that comes from hearing the truth spoken in an inconvenient tone. "My aunt," he said. I was not disorderly. "Then why does the room look like this?" "Because she is dead," I said, "and the living have begun upon her." Rain tapped more sharply against the glass. Somewhere in the corridor a footman passed with a careful tread and did not pause. The house was listening, but politely. Lord Westmore let his hand fall from the mantel. "Mr. Pike is my solicitor. He has removed what pertains to immediate household necessity. Mr. Pike has removed receipts before I have matched them to the annuity book." His expression altered by the smallest degree. "My aunt had one. Ladies of means often do. My aunt was of means once." There it was, not debt named but debt admitted by shape. I lowered my voice, though no one was in the room but us. "Then your lordship understands why I cannot sort in half, light with papers coming and going." "You are not in half light. That is a figure. I dislike figures." "Then we are poorly paired already." A breath escaped him that might have been amusement, had it not sounded so unwilling. He crossed at last to the desk and stopped opposite me. Up close he looked less composed, not more. A man may wear black superfine and still seem as though he has slept badly in it. There was a faint blue shadow beneath one eye. His gloves, though expensive, had been bent and tugged as if put on in haste more than once that morning. His gaze dropped to the ledgers. "Show me." I hesitated. "If I am paying for order," he said, "I should like at least a glimpse of the battle." He had a dry way of speaking when he chose it, unexpected, dangerous, because it made one forget for a moment that all power still sat on his side of the desk. I opened the nearest annuity volume and turned it so he could see. The pages were ruled in a narrow, disciplined hand with yearly amounts listed beside initials, parishes, and occasionally household descriptions too vague to satisfy any proper account. "Widow near Bakewell. Former nursery. Mrs. L. through the clergyman." Such phrases are not business entries. They are camouflage. "These are not all family annuities," I said. "How can you tell?" "Because if they were, they would have surnames." His eyes moved over the page. He was quicker than I had expected. Not expert, no, but capable of seeing where a thing jarred. "And if they are not family obligations, then they are personal ones." "My aunt had no personal obligations to speak of thing," I said and looked up. "That was not a request for silence, Mrs. Vale," I said. "Merely a declaration it would have been rude for me to contradict." "Were you acquainted with her?" "Not socially." "That is a very careful answer. It is the truest sort." He studied me long enough that I felt the schedule slip inside my sleeve as sharply as if it had been stitched there. It is an unpleasant thing to stand across from a man who has every right to ask what you know and no right at all to ask why your pulse has changed. At last he looked down again. "These entries," he said, touching one with a single finger. "What do you mean to do with them?" "Match them against correspondence, memoranda, and household disbursements. Determine which are active, which ended with the Countess's death, and which have been disguised as something else. And how long does that require? That depends how many papers Mr. Pike continues to carry off." He ignored the thrust. "D's." His jaw tightened. "I do not have days to indulge private archaeology. It is not private if it touches the estate. It touches the estate only if you can prove it. I can prove very little while your solicitor rearranges the evidence." He looked at me then in a way that made my skin go cool, not because it was intimate but because it was direct. Men often look through women who work. They see service, utility, trouble. He did not. He was deciding whether I was worth the inconvenience of believing. I held his gaze. Finally he said, "What is in the writing drawer?" "Very likely nothing of consequence." "Then why do you want it?" "Because ladies who are meticulous elsewhere are never careless only in one locked place." He glanced toward the small writing table near the window. "Rosewood. Elegant. Severe. The sort of piece one buys when one wishes to write many letters and have no one guess what they contain." "My aunt's personal desk," he said. "You believe she kept something there related to these entries?" "I believe she something there she did not wish lying in the open annuity book." He was silent again. This time I let him be. Silence, like ink, is best allowed to settle when a man is near deciding. At length he said, "If I permit access, nothing leaves this room without my knowledge. A poor arrangement for me. Better than none. I may need to take notes. You may take notes here. I may need to compare items. You may compare them here. Then I shall need the room left undisturbed." His glance flicked to the door. "You ask a great deal for a paid stranger. You ask a great deal for a man who wishes speed from a work that cannot be hurried." The answer should have annoyed him. Instead, that unwilling almost smile appeared again, very briefly, and made him look not younger exactly, but more human. I mistrusted the effect at once. "Mrs. Vale, has anyone ever told you that your tone improves nothing?" "Frequently." "And did you ignore them all?" "Not all, only the foolish ones." He turned away before I could be sure what he thought of that. Crossing to the window, He stood looking out at the rain for a moment with his hands behind his back. From where I stood I could see the strain in the line of his shoulders. It was not theatrical strain, not the sort that asks to be witnessed. The worst kind, the sort a man carries because he cannot yet afford collapse. When he spoke again, his voice was flatter. There is to be a visit on Thursday. From the valuers. No. He kept his face toward the window. From people with an interest in my sister. A marriage visit then, or the early machinery of one. Settlement papers. Assessments disguised as courtesy. I thought of the entries in the book. Schoolroom. Former nursery. Widow near Bakewell. Women's lives hidden under headings a man might overlook if he were in haste to save a house. And the room must be made presentable. He added, the accounts must appear manageable. A Hartcombe must not look as though it is held together by sealing wax and stubbornness. I could not help myself. Is it not? His head turned slightly. I am not in the habit of discussing my affairs with hired strangers. No, I said. Only asking us to repair them. He faced me fully again. Can you do it? Repair them? No, understand them. Perhaps. That was not the answer I was hoping for. It is the answer you require. He came back to the desk, reached for the key Mrs. Bryce had left near the tray, and held it a moment between finger and thumb. A small key, brass, worn at the teeth. It should not have looked important, yet my pulse climbed as though he were holding a pistol. If I find, he said quietly, that you are making difficulty where none exists, you will leave Hartcombe tomorrow. If I find, I said just as quietly, that papers continue to disappear before I have seen them, I will leave Hartcombe today. That earned me his full attention. Outside the rain lessened. A paler light moved over the desk, over the open annuity book, over his hand and the key in it. For one absurd second I had the feeling that something had altered between us. Not in tenderness, certainly not in trust, but in the plain knowledge that the other could not be managed by ordinary means. Then he set the key on the blotter between us. Very well, he said. You shall have the drawer. My hand did not move toward it. And the blue cabinet. He gave me a look almost stern enough to be called respectable. One extortion at a time, Mrs. Vale. Lord Westmere, if you insist on treating method as extortion, we shall both have a miserable week. I expect that already. The truth of it sat between us. I reached then and took the key. The metal was warm from his hand. A foolish thing to notice. I noticed it nonetheless. His gaze dropped, not my face but to my fingers closing over the brass. Then, with the quiet accuracy of a man who missed little when he chose to see, he said, you asked first for the drawer and only after for the books. I kept my expression still. Did I? You did. It was nearest to hand. No, he said. It was nearest to your mind. And there, before I could answer, before I could decide whether deflection or candor would better serve me, he laid his palm upon the packet I had drawn off behind the desk at his entrance. Not possessively, not rudely, merely with interest. What? He asked. Did you find before I came in? What? He asked. Did you find before I came in? It is one thing to prepare for a question and another to hear it put plainly by a man who expects plain answers. I looked at his hand where it rested on the packet, then at his face. A copy letter, I said, and a loose schedule slip tucked beneath it. Concerning these amps, I believe so. Then, let me see them. I might still have refused. I might have said that he was interrupting a process, and that conclusions pulled too early often go lame. But he had already given me the drawer key. To deny him now would not have been caution, it would have been panic. And panic, in my experience, is the quickest road to discovery. So I reached for the packet, drew it out from beneath his hand, and untied the ribbon fully. The first sheet lay uppermost, as it had before. Brown ink, clean margins, formal language made more formal by copying. My own old hand looked back at me with the composed neatness I had once cultivated for money. I set the page flat. Lord Westmere bent slightly over the desk to read. I watched his face instead of the writing, because I could not bear both at once. Continue the Michaelmas allowance as before. Ah, he read. But let the amount be divided before it leaves the house. One part to be sent through the rector, one through the apothecary, and no surname written in the household book beyond the initial. Mrs. L. must not be pressed to attend in person. He looked up. This is very odd. He read on. The schoolroom account is to remain separate. The girl is not to be named unless Anne asks after her directly. His gaze sharpened a fraction, Anne. He lowered his eyes again to the page. And the final line. The old arrangement is to be continued until I say otherwise, as interruption would expose more than inconvenience. He straightened. Esport, if I knew that, I said, I should already be further along. You call this a copy letter. Where is the original? Possibly destroyed. Possibly elsewhere. Possibly never sent in its first form at all. You mean my aunt wrote instructions and then had them copied to hide her own hand? That is one possibility. I heard how calm my voice sounded and hated it. There are moments when one's own composure feels like treachery. He touched the lower corner of the page. This does not look like my aunt's hand. Do you know whose it is? I lifted the schedule slip instead. What I know is that the hand on the copy matches the hand on this note, and that both were folded inside the annuity packet rather than left with the ordinary correspondence. He took the slip from me. His fingers brushed mine in the exchange. A slight thing. Even so, I felt it more than I ought. He studied the narrow columns. Lady Day, he said. Midsummer Michaelmas. Christmas. 4 distributions. And these initials. 3 of them recur in the annuity book. One appears nowhere else. He passed the slip back. Then perhaps the missing one was ended. Perhaps. I laid the slip beside the letter. But ended arrangements are usually crossed through, or dated, or tied off in some way that saves later confusion. My aunt disliked confusion. So I am beginning to think. He drew out the chair opposite and sat, as if he had abandoned any thought of haste for the present, though not, I believed, the desire to master the ground beneath his feet. Seated, he still seemed guarded but less severe. Fatigue showed more plainly when he was still. Go on, he said. I turned to the annuity volume and opened it to the page I had marked earlier with a scrap of blank paper. Here. Mrs. L. Through the clergyman. The amount matches the divided figure on the slip if one includes the smaller quarterly charges listed elsewhere as household medicine. He looked where I pointed. Medicine. Apothecary routes are useful if one does not wish a woman's name crossing too many desks. Why should a woman's name matter? In a house, I said. In a village. In an estate where every servant, trained tenant, and relation keeps an ear for weakness. For a dozen reasons. He said nothing. I continued more quietly. A widow may be respectable and still not wish it known that she depends on a great house. A girl may be under instruction somewhere that cannot easily be explained. A wife may be living apart from her husband without wanting the parish to count the days. Money to women is seldom merely money. It is often a wall. By his gaze moved from the book to me and back again. You speak as though you know it. I know enough. At least was true without danger. I turned 2 pages forward. Here is the schoolroom entry. No surname. Only for line in books and French to continue while useful. That is not how one enters charity for strangers. Nor school fees for kin. It is too careful in one direction and not careful enough in another. My aunt had companionable schemes, he said. She liked arranging people. She may have liked protecting them better. He leaned back slightly. You make her sound like a conspirator. I glanced at the copied letter. A lady who divides payments, routes them through respectable hands, suppresses surnames, and warns against exposure is at the least a manager of secrets. The rain touched the windows again, lighter now. The room had grown brighter in spite of it. Morning was moving toward noon. The fire gave a low soft crack. From somewhere below stairs came the faint ring of a bell and the answering tread of a servant crossing the hall. Lord Westmore let his eyes rest on the page another moment. There is nothing here to prove wrongdoing. No. Only concealment. Those are not the same. They become close companions when estates are examined. A faint crease appeared beside his mouth. You improve nothing by sounding pleased. I am not pleased. No. I closed the annuity book gently. If these arrangements were harmless, they would have been made plain. If they were cruel, they would more likely have vanished entirely. This sits between. And what sits between is usually the most troublesome sort of truth. He folded his arms. You speak in judgments. I sort papers for families who prefer not to say certain things aloud. Judgments are part of the hire. Something like resignation crossed his face. Very well, what next? The blue cabinet. You have already said so. And your lordship has already delayed it. A breath escaped him. Not laughter exactly, but near enough to make me cautious. He rose, went to the cabinet, and stood aside for me. I brought the copied letter and slip, then unlocked the cabinet door with the small side key already hanging from its inner escutcheon. Inside were 3 shallow drawers, all lined in faded blue paper, and above them a row of pigeonholes filled with folded correspondence. He watched while I lifted the first bundle free. These letters were older than the ones on the desk. Not ancient, merely settled. They had that compressed look paper takes on after years of remaining where it was first put. Most were routine notes from milliners, booksellers, charity committees, a rector's wife in Matlock with a poor opinion of someone's daughter, and 2 gentlemen with a much better opinion of their own ideas than their prose warranted. Then I found one written in a cramped female hand on cheap paper, folded twice, with no crest and only the address of a lodging house in Buxton. I opened it. The ink had browned. The hand wavered in places as though the writer had paused often, not from age perhaps, but from feeling. Your ladyship's goodness has secured the room through another quarter, and I pray God you may be rewarded for preserving us from publicity. I have told the child only that the books are from a friend. She applies herself well and asks after Miss Ashdown's drawing less than before. I remain with gratitude that cannot be repaid. No signature. Only M. I read it once to myself and then held it out to him. He took it more abruptly than he had taken the slip. Miss Ashdown's drawing. He read the line again. This is nonsense, he said, though not with conviction. My sister never knew anyone in Buxton. The letter does not say she did, only that the child asked after her drawing. A copied likeness may have been sent, or a sketch, or some older connection referred to in the house. My aunt painted badly. That has not prevented whole albums from changing hands in better families than yours or mine. He glanced up sharply at the last phrase. I let it pass. His eyes went back to the letter. Preserving us from publicity, he said. That sounds uglier. It sounds affray and the child. He crossed to the light and read it again near the window. I turned meanwhile to the second drawer of the cabinet and found memoranda, sealed bills, a packet of old theater notices, and beneath them a small book of private disbursements. Not the household accounts. Something slimmer and meaner. The sort of book one keeps for sums one does not wish argued over in the steward's room. I opened it. There they were. Not names. Never names. Only initials, quarter days, and occasional phrases in the Countess's decisive slanting script. Continue through hail. Alter amount after fever. Books to be sent plain. No inquiries in writing. My stomach tightened. Not because the thing shocked me now. That was past. But because the shape of it was so deliberate. This had not been one hasty kindness, nor two. It had been maintained. Adjusted. Hidden. Preserved over years. He turned from the window when I did not speak. What is it? I handed him the little book. He looked down. His face changed very little. Yet something went out of it all the same. Some lingering hope, perhaps, that this would prove sentimental confusion rather than a settled arrangement with roots under the whole house. He asked. I do not know yet. At least 3, perhaps 5 if the altered entries in the annuity volume belong here and not elsewhere. At what cost? There is no yearly total in this book, only quarter sums. Estimate it. I did, quickly. More quickly than he would have liked, perhaps because the swiftness itself told him I was not inventing difficulty to justify my fee. It would depend, I said, on whether all are still active. If they are, then enough to matter. That is not an estimate. It is the truthful version of one. Oh, he shut the little book with a force just short of anger. Everything in this room appears to matter. You say it as though you enjoy pronouncing sentence. And you hear everything as though it were an accusation. His jaw set. For a moment I thought I had gone too far. Then he placed the book very carefully on the desk, which is what angry men do when they must not strike it. My father left things unfinished, he said. My aunt left things hidden. The house has not had a season of plain dealing in years, it seems. That was the most he had yet said, which approached confidence. I answered it carefully. Plain dealing is rarely attempted until concealment becomes too expensive. His gaze snapped to mine. There it was. The lev wire beneath all the black cloth and composure. Too expensive. So the matter had reached that point already. He looked away first. You assume much from very little, Mrs. Vale. You pry. You hired me. I did no such thing. My aunt's solicitor engaged you before her death. Then your lordship may dismiss me. The words lay between us. He did not take them up. Instead, he reached for the copied letter again and read the final line once more. Interruption would expose more than inconvenience. What was she protecting? He said. Though I no longer thought he asked me alone, I looked at the Buxton letter in his hand, at the initials in the small book, at the quarter days on the slip. Woman, I said. At the least, perhaps children. Perhaps someone tied to the family in a manner the family preferred unspoken. And now the protection may fail for want of money, or for want of silence. Usually the one ruins the other soon enough. He said nothing for several breaths. Then, quietly, my sister's prospects must not be touched by this. There it was, not the whole of his fear, only the part he could afford to utter. I cannot promise that, I said. His face hardened at once. I can promise. I went on, before pride on either side made a worse thing of it, that ignorance is no shield. If these papers belong to a long arrangement and someone outside this room already suspects as much, then speed without understanding may do more damage than care. You speak of someone outside this room. Who? I bent over the open packet once more. The copied letter, the slip, the Buxton note, the little private book. Too neat in one place, too thin in another. My fingers moved to the ribbon. Brown. But cut, not untied. Cut. I said. Lord Westmore saw the change in my face. What is it? I lifted the ribbon ends. Did you do this when you opened the packet? I found it only loosened. He took the ribbon from me, examined the edge, then the torn wafer still clinging to the back sheet. A seal had been lifted and pressed down again. Not well enough for me to miss it now I knew to look, but well enough to pass a hasty eye. There should be more residue here, I said softly. And the fold is wrong. Someone opened this after it was first tied. He looked up. We were no longer dealing only with the dead. For a moment neither of us spoke. The room had grown so quiet that I could hear the rain slipping from the ivy outside in separate drops. A fire settled in the grate with a faint sigh. Somewhere below stairs a maid laughed, then checked herself at once, as though even cheer must mind its shoes in a house under mourning. Lord Westmore still held the cut ribbon between 2 fingers. You are certain, he said. How? I took it back and laid it on the blotter, because whoever did it had patience enough to press the seal down again, and not judgment enough to remember that paper learns how it has been folded. This packet lay flat too recently, and the ribbon was sliced, not untied. A person in haste cuts. A person with right of access untees. He looked at the altered wafer, then at the packet, then at the small private disbursement book. How recently? That I cannot say. Not yesterday. The paper would still be more rebellious. I touched the edge of the letter. Not years ago either. But it has settled only partly. He gave a short nod, as if he disliked both the answer and my calm in delivering it. Then someone opened it after my aunt's death. Who? A person with access to the room, or to the papers after they were removed from it. But his expression cooled. You mean my solicitor. I mean only what the packet allows me to mean. You employ very freely for a woman so attached to precision. I met that cleanly. And your lordship hears accusation very clearly for a man who claims to dislike figures. That unwilling almost smile touched his mouth again and vanished before it softened him. Mrs. Vale, there is a difference between a fact and a conclusion. Yes, I should be delighted if the house would stop removing the first before I can arrive at the second. He turned away from the desk and paced once, not in agitation exactly, but in the manner of a man who is trying to think while his anger insists on being counted first. He crossed to the window. Rain silvered the lower panes. Beyond them the yew walk was dark with wet, the gravel court pale and empty beneath the cloud. When did my aunt die? I asked. He kept his face toward the glass. 8 days ago. Since then, he said. There have been doctors, clergymen, relations who thought absence at the funeral would be remarked upon, and 3 separate men who have each, in his own style, informed me that old houses are expensive to feel sentimental over. That is a very crowded week for honesty. He let that pass. Mr. Pike has had access to the papers, he said. So has Mrs. Bryce, though she would sooner swallow a cold and tamper with household records. My sister was in here one morning, but only for a few minutes. 2 footmen carried boxes out under instruction. I was present for part of that. Not all of it. He turned back. And now there is you. There was no offense in the sentence. Merely arrangement. He was laying out the field as he would have laid out fence lines or tenancies. I respected that more than I liked it. And now there is me. I agreed. His eyes rested on my face a moment longer than before. Not warm. Not suspicious either. Measuring. At least you do not flinch from being counted among the possibilities. No, I said, because innocence that makes speeches is usually trying too hard. That brought a real change to him. Not softness. Interest. Begin, he said. To understand why my aunt engaged you. Do you? She liked people who were useful in unpleasant rooms. I could not decide whether that ought to have offended me. Before I managed to do so, his gaze fell to the small brass key still lying near the annuity book. The drawer, he said. He came back to the desk. We stood now on the same side of it, not by consent exactly, but by necessity. I took up the key. The writing table near the window had slender legs and a severe elegance that would have suited a woman who valued order and concealment equally. A blotter remained upon it, green leather darkened at the center by years of use. 2 quills stood in a tray. The sand shaker was capped. Nothing outwardly careless, nothing humanly spilled. I fitted the key to the small middle drawer. It did not turn. I tried again more gently, then once more with a little pressure. Nothing. Lord Westmere held out his hand. Give it here. I passed him the key. He bent over the lock, his shoulder close enough that I caught the clean, damp scent of rain clinging to wool. A ridiculous thing to notice at such a time. I noticed it nonetheless. He tried the key with no better success than mine. It should fit, I said. It does not. He withdrew it and examined the bit. The metal was worn, but not ruined. Has the lock been changed? In a writing drawer, I said. Not unless the Countess expected burglars with literary tastes. He crouched slightly and looked closer. No, the brass is scratched, freshly. He stepped aside. I bent and saw it at once, a tiny bright marks around the keyhole, where older brass had been scored through to a cleaner color beneath. Picked, I said. Not forced. Not forced. The wood would show bruising. This is fiddler work. He straightened slowly. My aunt's packet opened. Her drawer picked. Her disbursement book hidden in the wrong cabinet. This improves nothing. No, I said. But it improves direction. How? Because random disorder is harder to pursue than selective disorder. A person who searches does so for some reason. Money, perhaps, or names, or proof, or the removal of proof. He slid the key into his pocket at once, on instinct. He looked back. A habit. A telling one. I have just discovered that what is not in my pocket may cease to exist in its proper place. That is sensible. Irritating, but sensible. He ignored the middle of that. I touched the underside of the drawer front. Sometimes ladies of careful habit tuck papers beneath a lip rather than in a compartment. Not for perfect concealment but for speed. My fingers found only smooth wood. Then at the left inner edge something rougher. Wax. There, I said. Lord Westmer came nearer again. Between us we tipped the writing table a fraction from the wall. Behind it, wedged against the paneling where it had likely fallen unseen, lay a folded sheet sealed with dark red wax. The crest pressed shallowly enough that only part remained legible. He reached first, then stopped. "Do you mind?" The question surprised me enough that I answered honestly, and he picked the paper up and handed it to me rather than opening it himself. The seal was broken already. Not yesterday's break, not today's. Still broken. I unfolded it carefully. It was not a letter but a memorandum, written in the late Countess's own hand this time, smaller and more hurried than the formal notes in the household books. Should anything happen to me before Easter, the schoolroom payments are to continue from the silver reserve until Westmere understands the nature of the obligation. Anne is to know nothing until her future is secure. If Pike presses for a complete schedule, he is to be put off. The Buxton matter must never be handled as charity. It would be fatal if named wrongly. No signature. None needed. Lord Westmere read over my shoulder. The line of his body changed before he spoke, not with melodrama but with a kind of inward recoil. Fatal if named wrongly. To whom? He said. I do not know. Westmere understands the nature of the obligation. He read again, quieter now. Which Westmere? The previous one, I think. My father. He stepped back. Until then he had seemed burdened, tired, pressed, suspicious, impatient. All those things a man may remain while still standing upon the old assumption that his inheritance, however reduced, is at least intelligible. I saw that assumption leave him. My father knew, he said. It was not truly addressed to me, yet I answered because silence then would have been cruelty. It appears so. I'd left none of it explained. Not where explanation could survive him. His mouth tightened. That sounds like him. It was the first personal judgment he had made in my hearing. Sharp. Unadorned. Entirely revealing for being so little. He took the memorandum from my hand and read it once more alone. The room seemed to wait with him. Rain. Fire. House. All listening. At length he folded the paper with far more care than the person who had broken the seal upon it. This stays with me. That may be wise. You do not object. I object to many things, I said. Not to your keeping one of the few papers which proves the late Countess meant this arrangement to continue. He looked at me then, properly. Continue, he repeated. You say it very steadily, because the paper says it steadily, and if continuing it ruins the estate. There it was at last, no longer disguised as haste or practicality. I answered him no less plainly. Then the estate is already ruined in one direction or another. Only the method remains to be chosen. His eyes narrowed slightly, but not in anger. You speak as though houses were people. Houses are hung about with people. That is worse. For the first time he did smile, though only with one side of his mouth, and even that carried fatigue in it. Mrs. Vale, do you ever improve? No, my lord, I only clarify. That is what I was afraid of. He walked back to the desk and laid the memorandum beside the copied letter and the little disbursement book. Then he stood with both hands braced on the blotter, head lowered a moment, not in surrender but in calculation. I did not interrupt him. One learns when not to step on a gentleman's silence if one wishes him to remain honest in it. At last he said, Thursday cannot be stopped. The visit, and your sister, must be protected. I chose my next words carefully. Protected from what? The truth, or the public version of it. His head came up at once. I went on before he could retreat behind rank. There is a difference. A Miss Ashdown is to be judged in this house as part of some alliance or settlement. Then facts discovered elsewhere and named badly may do more harm than facts spoken at the right time by the right person. You recommend I explain to my sister that her dead aunt maintained hidden payments to women in Buxton and elsewhere for reasons not yet fully understood. I recommend only that ignorance rarely bargains well. He stared at me. Then he gave a short breath that was nearer frustration than mirth. You recommend a great deal for a paid stranger. And your lordship resists it a great deal for a man who already knows I am right. He did not answer that. Instead, he crossed to the bell-pull and rang. A moment later, a footman appeared at the door. Thomas, Lord Westmere said, send word to Mr. Pike that the probate papers in the morning room are not to be removed, rearranged, copied, or summarized without my direct instruction. No one enters here without Mrs. Bryce, Mrs. Vale, or myself is present. Do the footman blinked once, rapidly. Yes, my lord. And tell Mrs. Bryce that Mrs. Vale will take her meals here until further notice. That surprised the footman even more. It surprised me as well, though I kept my face composed. Wes, my lord, and Thomas, my lord, if anyone asks why Mrs. Vale is working under my authority in this room, the answer is that my aunt's papers are in disorder, and I will have them made straight before Thursday. Nothing more. My lord, the footman withdrew. I waited until the door shut before I said, you realize that will not stop anyone speaking. No. He came back from the bell-pull. But it will determine the first version they speak. A useful instinct. I have one or two. I begin to see it. His glance moved over me dry again. Do not sound so astonished. I returned to the desk and gathered the papers into cleaner order than I felt. The copied letter, the slip, the Buxton note, the memorandum. 4 directions of one truth, none yet sufficient by itself. Outside, the rain had thinned to mist. The windows held a weak silver brightness. Noon could not be far off, I said. There is something else. There always is. Yes. I think you ought to prepare yourself for the possibility that whoever opened the packet did not find all they wanted. He went still. Why? Because the memorandum had fallen behind the table rather than been taken. Because the copied letter remained though disturbed. Because the drawer was picked but not empty. That suggests interruption or ignorance. Or both. You mean someone searched without understanding what they sought, and may search again. He looked toward the door, then back to the papers. The decision, when it came, altered the room more than his entrance had done. You will remain a Hartcombe, he said, until this is understood. It was not phrased as a request. Still, I heard the layer beneath it not command only, but need. I was engaged for the sorting, I said. You are now required for the truth. That is a poor adjustment to make in a lady's hire. I shall amend the terms. I ought to have objected. I ought at least to have reminded him that I did not belong to his household and had no wish to be taken into a nobleman's necessity as though that necessity settled all questions. Instead, I asked, what terms? Your fee doubled. That almost made me laugh because it was so very much the answer of a man born to estates and obligations. When the ground splits, lay money over it first and see if that answers. My lord, I said, if I were the sort of woman who could be bought into silence, we should not be having this conversation. Something changed in his face at that. Not offense. Shame, perhaps, or only recognition. I did not mean silence, he said. No, you meant importance expressed in the language men trust most. His gaze did not leave mine. Then let me express it differently. I said nothing. One, I tell you to remain, he said more carefully now. I do not mean as a servant pressed past her contract. I mean that if these papers concern living women and possibly children, and if another person in the house, or out of it, has already begun searching, then you are safer here under acknowledged authority than coming and going alone under gossip. Much better. Worse, because it was better. You think there will be gossip regardless. I think there already is. Yes, I said quietly. There usually is. He watched me hear it. That, too, was a form of courtesy. I shall not have your name damaged for doing work I have sanctioned, he said. I could have told him that gentlemen often believe their protection extends further than it does. That a man may command his servants and still not command the village, the neighboring callers, the women who write letters across breakfast tables, or the clergyman's wife who stores scandal as a squirrel stores nuts. I could have told him that my name had already survived worse things than rain accounts and a nobleman's impatience. But the image rose before me then of the Buxton letter. The child, the schoolroom payments, fatal if named wrongly. If I left now, the papers might be narrowed, softened, or simply made presentable before Thursday. One hidden arrangement would become no arrangement at all. Money rotted through parishes and apothecaries would cease because ceasing was tidy. The women under those initials would be reduced to inconvenience. An inconvenience in great houses is the easiest thing in the world to dismiss. I do not remain, I said slowly, for your protection. But his mouth moved a fraction. No. I remain because if I go, these women lose the only advocate in the room who has not inherited the problem. He accepted that with more grace than many men would have shown. Very well. And I require full access. You shall have it. No papers removed. None. No summaries prepared by Mr. Pike before I have seen the originals. At that his eyes sharpened again. You are determined to dislike my solicitor. I'm determined to dislike anyone who edits before I have read. He inclined his head. Doan. I looked down at the memorandum, then at the copied hand which was mine and had once been sold for need, and finally at the small disbursement book whose entries had kept somebody housed, taught, quiet, or all three. Yes, I said. It was a small word, yet it seemed to settle more than the matter of my stay. Lord Westmore gave one short nod, as though an agreement had at last been reached between adults rather than combatants. Then we begin properly, he said. We already did. Mrs. Vale. My lord. If this week proves miserable, as I expect it will, I should like it recorded somewhere that you predicted as much. I gathered the memorandum and the copied letter into a new order. I shall put it in the margin, I said. In a very neat hand. That almost smile returned once more, and this time it stayed long enough to make look dangerously like a man one might trust. Then the clock on the mantel struck noon, and the house, the papers, and the rain gathered themselves around us as if to remind us both that agreement was not rescue. Not yet. Chapter 2. Debts along the parish road. By 1:30 I was in Hartcombe's smaller carriage with the annuity book on my lap and Lord Westmore opposite me, which was proof enough that agreement and ease are not the same thing. The rain had thinned to a wet brightness that left the hedges shining and the road uncertain. Derbyshire in spring never quite decides whether it means to bloom or punish. The wheels sank at the edges of the lane and found firmer ground in the middle, where old ruts had been beaten into a kind of reluctant service by years of carts' hooves, and estates trying not to look poorer than they were. His lordship had changed nothing of his dress since morning, only his coat, which was now better suited to travel and less suited to receiving condolences. The memorandum and the copied letter were in his pocketbook. The annuity volume remained with me. We had not discussed that distribution. It had arranged itself, which was perhaps why I mistrusted it less. Neither of us had spoken for the first mile. That was not awkwardness. It was accounting. A man who has just discovered that his dead aunt managed hidden obligations does not immediately become conversational. A woman who once copied one of those obligations for money does not rush to fill the silence. The hedgerows gave way at last to lower stone walls darkened by wet. Beyond them lay fields not yet fully green, with sheep scattered over them like scraps of old cloud fallen where they ought not. The church tower of Hartcombe village rose ahead, square and plain. Beside it the rectory sat in a patient posture, respectable without prosperity. I knew the sort of house. Good curtains bought 5 years too early and kept 10 years too long. Hall flags scrubbed by women whose own boots leaked. A study full of sermons, parish maps, and unpaid appeals. Lord Westmore glanced through the glass at the tower. You know the rector. Not intimately. That sounds again like a careful answer. It is a practical one. A clergyman may know my handwriting, my father's opinions, and the exact condition of my childhood boots without my having ever sat in his drawing room by choice. Your father was in the church, and your husband. Also, his gaze lifted briefly to my face, then dropped. I see. No, I thought, you see very little. But men seldom understand at once what it means to spend one's life among church papers and women's economies, among subscriptions, allowances, school bills, relief lists, and the thousand little dignities people preserve by sending money in the right name from the right hand. I did not enlighten him further. We are not calling socially, I said instead. That should help us. Do you think the rector will show us his parish records merely because I own the land under his windows? No. I think he will show us because if he has served as a route for those annuities, he will understand at once that concealment has become harder to preserve than disclosure. And if he prefers concealment, then he will quote principle, conscience, female delicacy, and possibly St. Paul until we are both too tired to resist him. That drew from Lord Westmore one of those short breaths that meant he was nearer amusement than he wished to admit. You have a charitable view of the clergy. I have an accurate one. The carriage slowed before the churchyard gate. The stones stood close together there, old and leaning, as though death had been admitted in a hurry and regretted none of it afterward. The ground underfoot would be wet. My boots were sensible but not invincible. I folded the annuity book in my arms, gathered my skirts, and prepared to descend. Lord Westmore was down first. He turned and held out his hand. It would have been absurd to refuse. More absurd to make a ceremony of accepting. So I placed my gloved fingers in his and stepped carefully to the ground. His hand was steady, warm despite the damp air. He let go at once. The exchange was proper. Entirely so. Nevertheless, the old women who lived on either side of the lechgate and saw all things worth repeating would have been content with the material. The rector received us in his study with a face already arranged for concern. Mr. Hale was one of those men who appear to have been born at 50 and then proceed from there without visible alteration. His black coat was brushed thin at the elbows. His neckcloth had been tied by a hand more economical than artistic. A coal fire burned in the grate more for the room's papers than its visitors, I thought. Books lined the walls in double rows. A dambrella stood by the door beside 2 pairs of muddy pattens and a child's broken hoop. My lord, he said, bowing. Mrs. Vale, this is unexpected. Then we are fortunate to have surprised you before you had leisure to prepare an answer, I said. Mr. Hale blinked once, then looked at Lord Westmore as though to confirm he hadn't indeed brought me with him on purpose. His lordship, to his credit, did not disown me. We require a little assistance. Mr. Hale, the rector's mouth drew in slightly. If it lies within my office, that depends, I said, on whether your office has lately acted as a forwarding address for a woman entered in Hartcombe's accounts only as Mrs. L. There are questions which open rooms and questions which close them. This was the second sort, though only for a moment. Mr. Hale's face did not change much. Clergymen are trained early against surprise, yet his fingers, resting on the back of a chair, tightened enough to whiten at the joints. I do not discuss parish women by initial with visitors, he said. Would you discuss them by hunger? I asked. Lord Westmore's head turned a fraction at that, but he let me continue. We are not here to expose anyone for sport, I said. A private arrangement tied to Hartcombe's accounts has been discovered in damaged form. If the route is not properly understood, payments may be interrupted through ignorance. That would be a tidy result on paper and a ruinous one elsewhere. Mr. Hale looked from me to Lord Westmere and back again. His lordship said, very evenly, "You may speak before Mrs. Vale as before me. She has my full authority in this matter." That changed the room more than rank alone had done. Authority acknowledged aloud is one of the few currencies village men respect immediately, even when it is extended to a woman they would rather have ignored. Mr. Hale moved at last to the desk. "I see," I said. "Not yet, but you may help us too." He gave me a look which contained mild disapproval, theological patience, and reluctant surrender in equal parts. "Mrs. Vale, if you continue in that tone, I shall begin to suspect the late Countess chose you for your methods rather than your penmanship. She may have done both." At this time Lord Westmere did not quite disguise the twitch at one corner of his mouth. Mr. Hale unlocked a lower drawer and withdrew a narrow ledger bound in calf. Parish relief, I thought at once, from the look of it. He opened not at the first page but somewhere near the back, which was answer enough before he read a word. "There is a widow," he said carefully, "lodging in one of the old stone cottages beyond the mill road. Respectable, quiet. Her husband served on this estate some years ago. She has had intermittent assistance, though not through the ordinary poor rate." "Lodging under what?" I asked. He hesitated. Lord Westmere said, "Mr. Hale." The rector exhaled. "Larkin, Mrs. Miriam Larkin. A surname at last. Not in the estate book. In the parish one." I opened the annuity volume on his desk and turned it toward him. "Mrs. L. through the clergyman. The amount is divided in the Countess's private notes before reaching the household books. One portion through you, one through the apothecary. Is that correct?" He glanced down, then away, offended that paper had made him confess before conscience could arrange its own dignity. "Substantially. Substantially is a word men choose when the truth has become embarrassing," I said. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "I shall remind you that the church is not a debtor's office." "No," I replied. "It is where society stores its cleaner evasions." If that stung, he deserved it. Still, I softened the next line. "Because one must not humiliate the only man in the room who had likely been trying, however clumsily, to keep a woman fed without letting the village smell weakness on her." "What I need to know," I said, "is whether the assistance was occasional kindness or sustained obligation." Mr. Hale looked at the ledger in front of him. "Sustained. How long?" He ran one finger down the page. 7 years under my hand. Longer, if one counts the notes left by my predecessor. Lord Westmere spoke for the first time in several minutes. 7 years. Mr. Hale did not meet his eyes. "My lord, on what grounds?" The rector's face worked slightly. This was the true point of pain then. Not the money, the naming. "I was not told the full history," he said. "Only that Mrs. Larkin was not to be handled as a pauper and never to be entered in any household list by full name. The late Countess made that instruction very plain." "Why?" said Lord Westmere. Mr. Hale's answer came after too long a pause. "Because the woman would have suffered if named wrongly." I thought of the memorandum behind Hartcombe's writing table and felt the line return beneath my skin. "Fatal if named wrongly." Lord Westmere's voice cooled. "That is not explanation, it is repetition. It is what I was given, my lord. And you accepted it." "I accepted," said Mr. Hale with a little more firmness now. "Regular means by which a widow might keep a roof over her head without being paraded through the village as an object lesson in fallen dependence. If there was fault in that, I shall answer for it in due season." No one spoke for a moment after that. It is a strange thing to watch a gentleman discover that what offends him in the abstract may already have clothed itself in a fire, a cottage, a woman, and perhaps a child. Abstractions yield more easily than flesh does. I said, "Does Mrs. Larkin live alone?" Mr. Hale's gaze shifted again very slightly, "But enough," I said. "There is a child." He admitted. "Nearly 12. The schoolroom entry." I murmured. Lord Westmere looked at me. "You think the child is the same one?" "I think the Countess was too careful for coincidence." Mr. Hale shut the ledger halfway, as though that might contain what had already escaped it. "I will not have the child drawn into neighborhood talk." "Nor will I," I said. "Which is why we are here before the arrangement collapses into gossip." His lordship's eyes remained on the rector. "Has my sister seen the child?" "Not to my knowledge." "But," he stopped. "But what?" said Lord Westmere. Mr. Hale looked older all at once. "Sketch was sent once. The late Countess asked that it be copied from a portfolio at the house and forwarded folded among books. I presumed it an indulgence. The girl had taken a childish fancy to some drawing Miss Ashdown had done years ago. I felt rather than saw Lord Westmere go still. Not outrage. Not yet. Calculation touching blood. "And the child's father?" he asked. Mr. Hale's mouth thinned. "I was never told. A new one in that room believed that sentence complete. The rector believed it was all he could safely say. Lord Westmere believed the omission significant. I believed both things at once. A clock somewhere in the hall struck the quarter. Rain moved against the panes in a brief soft rush, then passed on. The room smelled of coal smoke, old leather, damp wool, and the faint medicinal sharpness of ink. I looked down at the parish ledger. Under Mrs. Larkin's name, in a narrow side column, were sums so modest they would have seemed almost insulting had they not been the exact shape of survival. Rent contribution, coal in winter, linen once. Books, a doctor after fever, not indulgence. Maintenance at the lowest level compatible with respectability. Lord Westmore saw it too. She was not being kept grandly, he said. No, said Mr. Hale, only kept from slipping low work. His lordship's gaze remained on the page. And if Hartcombe had ceased payment after my aunt's death? Mr. Hale answered him plainly then. The cottage would likely have gone by midsummer. There, the human face of the figure, not a seduction, not a hidden carriage, not some romantic folly tucked into a countess's declining years. A widow in a cottage near the Mill Road, a girl nearly 12, and enough money each quarter to keep hunger from becoming public. Lord Westmore put one gloved finger on the ledger margin, not touching the entries themselves. We will see her. Mr. Hale looked alarmed at once. My lord, I strongly advise against arriving at her door in company. He need not arrive at all, I said. Both men turned to me. I shall go, I said. If she has had years of discreet assistance, the sudden appearance of an earl in mourning will frighten her into saying nothing useful. Lord Westmore's expression changed at once to disapproval. I have full authority, I reminded him. You have just warned against gossip. Yes, which is why I may call as a clergyman's daughter on a matter of parish subscription, while your lordship may remain in the lane and alarm no one. Mr. Hale, to my satisfaction, looked relieved. Lord Westmore did not. Mrs. Vale, he said, I did not bring you here to send you alone into unknown cottages. No, you brought me here because I understand what the paper is not saying. That does not improve the cottage. Neither will rank. He stared at me long enough that Mr. Hale had the grace to study a bookshelf rather than witness the contest too directly. At last Lord Westmore said, I shall remain outside the gate. That will still be too near if she sees you first. Then I shall remain farther off. How noble. How tiresome. That was nearly our first easy exchange since morning, which seemed a poor triumph under the circumstances. Even so, I saw Mr. Hale's brows lift at it. There would be some use in that later, I thought grimly. A rector who notices tonal shifts notices other things as well. I closed the annuity book and gathered it back into my arms. Very well, I said. Mr. Hale, will you write the direction? He did. As he sanded the note, Lord Westmore stood by the fire and looked not at us but into the coals, as though somewhere within them the shape of his aunt's silence might yet become legible. When Mr. Hale handed me the folded paper, his fingers brushed mine briefly. Mrs. Vale, he said in a lower voice than before, if she asks whether the house means to cast her off, I would urge you to answer carefully. I always do. No, he said gently. You answer exactly. That is not always the same mercy. Before I could reply, Lord Westmore turned. We shall not delay longer, he said. He sounded again like an earl. Control. Decisive. Entirely composed. Yet I knew now what lay beneath it, not only debt, but a dawning knowledge that the ledger of Hartcombe contained living people he had not known he owed. That sort of knowledge changes a man more quickly than grief does. We stepped back out into the wet churchyard light. The cottage lay beyond the Mill Road, where the lane narrowed, lost patience with wheels, and dissolved into mud at the edges. Mr. Hale's direction had been exact enough to find it and vague enough to preserve a conscience. Third after the broken ash, Lowstone, blue door once, now mostly weather. If one wished to protect a widow without announcing the fact, that was very like the church, accurate in hardship, discreet in paint. Lord Westmore kept his word and remained back where the lane bent. I saw him through the wet air only in intervals, a dark figure beside the hedgerow, one boot upon a stone, hat pulled low against the damp. He did not pace. He did not call after me. He stood as if holding his ground there cost him something, which in a man accustomed to command was perhaps true. I crossed the yard alone. The cottage had one cracked pane mended with paper and a door so often scrubbed that the grain showed through the old blue in pale ribs. Not ruin, not comfort either. The sort of place kept decent by constant refusal. I knocked. There was movement within at once, not the slow startled sort of a woman napping over mending, but the quick hush of a house in which every sound is measured before it is answered. A bolt shifted. The door opened no more than a careful hand's breadth. Mrs. Larkin looked at me with the expression of one already braced to deny a debt. She was perhaps 35, though wan and worry make poor calendars. Her dress had been turned and mended twice at least. Her face was thin, her eyes dark-ringed, her hair drawn back plainly with no attempt at softness. Yet there was nothing defeated in her posture. Only readiness. Yes, I beg your pardon for calling without notice, I said. My name is Mrs. Vale. I have come from Hartcombe on a matter which concerns some private papers of the late Countess. Her hand tightened on the door edge. I do not know what you mean. That is possible, I said. It is also possible you know exactly what I mean and have very good reason not to say so on a doorstep. A something flickered in her face at that. Not trust, recognition of method, perhaps. Behind her, farther in, I heard a child turn a page. I lowered my voice. I am not here to expose you. If I wished that, I should hardly have come alone. Her eyes went past my shoulder toward the lane, so she had seen him after all, or sensed rank by instinct. Village women often do. Houses teach it. The gentleman remains where he is, I said. He will not enter unless you ask it. That is his lordship. She gave the smallest bitter movement of her mouth. Then he has come late to his aunt's charities. Perhaps, I said, though I am beginning to think the arrangement was never charity. At that, the door opened wider by one cautious inch. The room behind her was neat enough to shame grander ones. 2 chairs by the hearth. A table laid with work rather than ornament. Shelves with more books than I expected in such a place, though they were mismatched and worn. On the settle by the fire sat a girl with a copybook on her knees, and a look of terrible stillness that belongs only to clever children who have learned that adults speak most freely when they are mistaken for furniture. Her hair was tied back with blue ribbon gone almost gray from washing. There was ink on one finger. I noticed that first because it told me more than her face did. You have books from the house, I said before I meant to. The child's hand closed over the copybook. Mrs. Larkin's expression sharpened. Who says so? No one. In what way? In the bindings, I said. And in the fact that your daughter sits as if she has been taught not only to read but to leave margins. That was when Mrs. Larkin first truly looked at me. A woman who has spent years preserving the difference between assistance and disgrace knows at once when another woman has seen the right thing and named it carefully. You had better come in, then, she said. I did. The girl rose when I entered, not from fear, I thought, but from manners drilled into her by someone who believed manners could still alter destiny if properly maintained. This is Lucy, said Mrs. Larkin. Lucy curtsied, not prettily but correctly. I returned the civility with the same seriousness. How do you do? Well, Mom. Her voice held a faint trace of schooling that did not belong naturally to the room. Go on with your work, said her mother. Lucy sat again, though the copybook remained closed. Mrs. Larkin did not offer me tea. Sensible. She had neither the means for unnecessary hospitality nor the wish to owe me even the appearance of one. Instead, she stood by the table and folded her hands. What papers? She asked. A copied instruction from the Countess. An annuity list rotted partly through the rector, partly through an apothecary. A memorandum saying the schoolroom payments were to continue from the silver reserve until Westmere understood the nature of the obligation. At the last phrase, all color left her face. He found that. He did. She sat abruptly in the chair nearest the table as if the strength had gone out of her knees. Not theatrically. Quietly. A woman who could not afford the luxury of fainting and therefore merely became pale. Lucy looked up. Mamma. It is nothing, love. Go on. Lucy did not go on. Children raised on uncertainty know when adults lie from kindness. Mrs. Larkin pressed her fingers to her brow once, then lowered them. And what does his lordship mean to do? He does not yet know. Then why is he here at all? Because the arrangement appears likely to fail if he remains ignorant of it. She gave a low harsh laugh with no mirth in it. Ignorant. Men of that family have always been allowed the comfort of that word. That was not a sentence one says by accident. I did not move, lest she retreat from it. You knew the late Earl. Her mouth thinned. I knew what it was to be noticed by gentlemen and forgotten by the world. There are moments in which a room seems to shift its weight around one sentence. This was one. Lucy stared hard at her closed copybook. I said very carefully, Does the child know who her father is? Mrs. Larkin's eyes came to mine with sudden ferocity. She knows she is not to be discussed as a shame. Good, I said. That answer startled her more than my question had. I am not here to pull at old humiliations, I said. I am here because the money was hidden in such a way that if the route is broken now, both you and the child are endangered. To prevent that, I must understand enough to name the matter rightly, or at least not wrongly. She sat utterly still. Then, after a long pause, she said, The old Earl was not kind. Let us begin there. Kindness is a lie grand people tell afterward. The Countess was the one who prevented the worst of it once she knew. And Miss Ashdown. Mrs. Larkin looked toward Lucy. The girl had lowered her head again, though I doubted she missed much. Not before her, said Mrs. Larkin. Then only this was the Countess protecting you from scandal, or the family from acknowledgement. Mrs. Larkin's laugh this time was softer and sadder. Do you know, Mrs. Vale, after enough years the two become much the same thing. A woman is housed. A child is taught. No one names the blood. The house keeps its dignity. We keep breathing. Which side is protected more? I had no answer that would not have insulted us both. Instead I asked, if payment stops now, what happens? She looked around the room as if measuring it against truth. The rent is due in 6 weeks. The winter coal bill remains partly unpaid. Lucy's books for summer have not yet been ordered. If the rector cannot forward what he always has, I begin selling things. After that, we move. After that, she stopped. After that the descent ceases to be hypothetical. I knew the shape of it well enough. Lucy spoke then, quietly and with more composure than some grown women command. Will I have to leave my French? Mrs. Larkin shut her eyes once. I looked at the girl. Not if I can help it. That was perhaps a foolish promise. Yet I made it. Lucy studied me with grave suspicion. Or you from the house? Then are you kind like the old lady, or grand like the others? The children sometimes perform surgery with one question. I am paid, said. I said, which often makes a person more reliable than either. But Lucy considered that and, to my surprise, seemed to approve. Mrs. Larkin let out a breath that might almost have been a laugh if there had been less at stake. You are an odd emissary for an earl. I have heard as much. She rose at last and crossed to a small drawer in the table by the hearth. From it she removed a folded paper, much handled, edges soft with being opened and shut too many times. She hesitated before giving it to me. This was sent with the first proper quarter after the Countess understood matters, she said. No signature, only instructions. I kept it in case ever I had to prove to someone that I had not invented the arrangement. I opened it. The hand was the late Countess's. Short lines. Clear directives. Lucy's school fees not to lapse under any excuse. Books to be renewed through Mr. Hale. No calling at Hartcombe. No letters beyond the agreed rote. The child is not to pay for the father's cowardice. I read that line twice. Not to pay for the father's cowardice. No romance. No sentiment, only judgment belayed and exact. When I looked up, Mrs. Larkin was watching me not with hope but with exhaustion sharpened by years. He used to send word he would acknowledge us when the time was easier, she said. When his health improved. When his son was settled. When the Countess was less watchful. Men always find a future in which courage will be cheaper. I folded the paper again and returned it. I should like to copy that line, I said. Her hand closed over the sheet. No, very well. Do you believe me? That surprised her too. Because, I added, Lears usually beautify, you have not. Mrs. Larkin sank back into her chair as if even belief had become one more effort. What will happen now? The truth will happen badly if I do nothing. Less badly if I do something. I am trying for the second. She looked past me toward the lane again. Und him. He is trying to understand the scale of what has been left him. That is a luxury, Wes, I said. But it may yet prove a useful one. When I left the cottage, Lucy was once more bent over her copybook. This time, as I reached the door, I glanced back and saw what she had been writing. French verbs in a neat schoolroom hand. The lane felt colder after the cottage fire. Lord Westmore came forward at once when he saw my face, then checked himself before he closed the distance too quickly. That, more than the movement itself, told me something had altered in him since morning. He was beginning to remember that urgency may alarm the very people one means to steady. Well, he said, not here. His eyes searched mine. Bad. Specific. That was enough. He did not press further. He handed me up into the carriage without commentary and gave the order to turn back toward Hartcombe. We had gone perhaps half a mile before he said, You are pale. So are you, my lord. It appears to be the day's fashion. He did not smile. What did she say? That the old earl was not kind, that the Countess preserved rather than created the arrangement, and that there is a child whose schooling has been maintained at the lowest level consistent with future use. The Countess meant the girl to have some chance beyond bare survival, but he looked out through the damp glass. And the father. She did not name him. She did not need to, but his head turned back slowly. You think it was my father. I think the late Countess wrote that the child was not to pay for the father's cowardice. He went very still. After a moment he said, those exact words. Rain began again, harder now, drumming softly on the roof. For several breaths he said nothing. Then, in a voice stripped flatter than before, did the child know who I was? She knew you were from the house. And feared what that meant. His jaw tightened. He looked down at his gloves, then removed them one finger at a set them beside him as if the leather itself had become intolerable. When he spoke again, it was not to me exactly. God. I let the silence stand. It is one thing to tell a man that an estate owes money to hidden dependents. Another to tell him there is a child in a cottage by the mill road learning French verbs on the charity of his dead aunt, because his dead father had not courage enough to name her. At last he said, My sister must not hear this from another mouth. Send we return at once. I said, but not at once to Miss Ashdown. He looked at me sharply. We return the papers, I said, and to the household books, and to whatever documents concern your sister's future. If the Countess wrote that Anne was to know nothing until her future was secure, then your aunt believed these matters touched one another more closely than either of us yet understands. He held my gaze a long moment. Then he nodded once. That was all. Yet the nod carried more weight than many speeches. Trust not given, perhaps, but employed. The carriage rolled on through the wet fields toward Hartcombe, and I sat with the annuity book on my lap, the smell of damp wool and old leather around me, and the child's line echoing after us like a bell not yet done sounding. By the time we reached Hartcombe, the rain had turned the front steps black and shining, and the house looked what it was: handsome, watchful, and more tired than it wished to seem. Thomas opened the door before the carriage had fully settled. He looked from Lord Westmore to me, then away again in the disciplined manner of a servant who had already understood there was something to understand and intended to survive it by appearing blank. "My lord," he said. "Mr. Pike is here." Of course he was. Lord Westmore handed off his hat and gloves without comment. Here. "In the library, my lord, with Miss Ashdown." That brought him fully still. Not for long. He moved again at once, but the pause had been enough. I saw the thought strike and set. If Pike was with Anne already, then time was shorter than either of us liked. "And Mrs. Bryce?" he asked. "In the housekeeper's room, my lord. Tell her Mrs. Vale and I are not to be disturbed in the late Countess's rooms for the next hour unless the house is on fire or Miss Ashdown sends for me herself." "Yes, my lord." Thomas vanished. Lord Westmore turned to me in the hall, rain dark still clinging to the shoulders of his coat. "You heard my sister first." "Quite right." He did not move. I knew then that he meant to leave me in the morning room while he went to Anne. Sensible, proper. Almost certainly what the house would expect. Yet if Pike was already laying out documents, arguments, or softened versions of both, then we could lose more in 20 minutes below stairs than we had gained all morning above. "You need not say it," I said. "Go." I was not about to dismiss you. No, you were about to do it politely. One side of his mouth moved, then settled. "Mrs. Vale, if Pike is with Anne, I must know what has already been said before I bring anything worse into the room." "That is also quite right. I do not like leaving these papers unattended." "Then take the memorandum with you and lock the morning room." He studied me for a brief moment. "And you?" "I shall not evaporate because a key has turned." "No," he said, quieter than before. "You never do." There was no softness in the sentence, and yet I felt it. He drew the memorandum and the copied letter from his pocketbook, hesitated, then handed only the copied letter to me. "This you may continue with. The memorandum remains with you." "That is wise." "I know." His hand brushed the key into my palm as he said it. Not the drawer key, the morning room key. The gesture was so practical that it would have passed unnoticed by anyone watching from the staircase. Even so, I felt the trust in it more than I ought. "I shall return as soon as I can," he said. "That depends on Mr. Pike." "It depends on my sister." He was right. I nodded and watched him go down the corridor toward the library, all restraint and black cloth, and the kind of urgency that had learned to keep its back straight in public. Then I went upstairs alone. The Countess's rooms lay in a hush that differed from the rest of the house. Bedrooms preserve a person's absence with more obstinacy than drawing rooms do. In the morning room the papers still waited where we had left them, the private book under a weight, the annuity volume open, the blue cabinet drawers only half closed. I locked the door, slid the key into my reticule, and stood a moment in the silence listening to the rain travel over the south windows. Then I began again. I started where I had not yet looked properly. The Countess's dressing room. Not because ladies' dressing tables usually yield financial truths. They do not. But they do yield habits, and habits arrange the rest. A woman who keeps old gloves by season may keep old letters by consequence. A woman who stores ribbons one by color may file her sins by household function. One learns these things. The dressing room was cooler than the morning room and smelled faintly of lavender gone dusty in the drawer sachets. The wardrobes stood open and mostly emptied. Gowns shifted into linen covers against moth and valuation alike. A workbasket remained by the chair, though its owner would do no more mending. Beside it stood a smaller escritoire with two shallow side drawers and a shelf below stacked with bandboxes and portfolios. In the first drawer I found nothing more alarming than hairpins, sealing wax, and old theater tickets folded into a case. In the second, correspondence from milliners, 2 notes from Anne Ashdown in a lighter, more impulsive hand, and a narrow packet tied in blue silk and marked for settlements Ix not household. That was promising in precisely the wrong way. I carried it to the dressing table and untied it. Inside lay copies of legal drafts, not in final engrossed form but in the half-domestic state such documents sometimes take when women wish to understand what men mean to decide for them before the men have finished deciding. Marriage portions, temporary trusts, a widow's jointure abstract in another lady's case. Then, nearer the back, a draft headed with Anne Ashdown's name and no date, amended in 2 hands, one legal, one the late Countess's. I read standing up because some papers improve one's judgment if they are not too comfortable to examine. The match under discussion had not been completed, only opened. But the figures were there plainly enough, the portion expected. The silver reserve named as contingent backing should ready liquid funds prove insufficient. The need to present Hartcombe as burdened but stable rather than encumbered and irregular. Burdened but stable. Encumbered and irregular. How politely men distinguish one danger from another when marriage is being priced. At the edge of the second page, in the Countess's own hand, was a note that nothing is to be altered in the schoolroom matter until Anne is past uncertainty. If the reserve is touched too visibly, questions will be asked in the wrong order. I read it twice, then a third time. So there it was, not the whole of the knot but enough to catch skin on. The silver reserve was not merely a vague family comfort. It had been considered as appearance, leverage, and promise in Anne's future. The hidden payments in Anne's settlement had been kept apart not because they belonged to different moral worlds, but because they touched the same money and the same fear. Wrong order. That phrase, more than the legal draft, felt like the Countess herself. Not do not ask. Not do not know. Only do not let the questions arrive in the wrong order. I laid the page flat and looked around the room as if the old lady might yet explain herself from the wardrobe shadows. A knock sounded at the morning room door. Not loud. Not timid. I froze, settlement draft in hand. "My lord," said a man's voice through the wood. "Mr. Pike's." Of course. I crossed the dressing room and into the morning room without haste, though my pulse had gone sharp again. The private book lay where we had left it. The annuity volume was still open. I gathered both, along with the settlement packet, carried them back to the dressing room, and slipped them beneath the linen covers in the lowest wardrobe shelf before returning to the locked door. "Wes," I called. A pause. "Then Mrs. Vale, is his lordship within?" "Indeed." Thomas seemed to think he might be upstairs. Then Thomas was mistaken. The pause lengthened. I imagined him on the far side of the door, gloves in hand, solicitor's mouth set in that mild line men adopt when they are about to be offended by female inconvenience. "I understood," he said at last, "that certain probate materials were to be reviewed this afternoon. Thr. Then I should be obliged if you had open." I looked at the key in my hand. "No," I said. Another pause. I could almost hear his astonishment arranging itself into a more acceptable shape. "Mrs. Vale," he said, more smoothly now, "I believe you mistake your role." "That is possible. Yet I am still not opening the door." The handle moved once very slightly, testing not forcing. He was too careful for outright banging. That would have looked ungentlemanly to any servant passing, and ungentlemanliness is merely another form of expense. "My instructions come from Lord Westmore," I said before he could speak again. "If you have business with the papers, you may bring it to him." "My business," said Pike, and there it was at last, the first thread of irritation, "is with the estate." "No doubt. The estate, however, is presently being read." Silence. Then footsteps retreated down the corridor. I stood still a moment longer, listening until I could no longer hear him. Only then did I breathe properly again. When Lord Westmore returned perhaps 20 minutes later, he found me in the dressing room seated on the edge of a low chair with Anne's settlement draft open across my knees and the Countess's note beside it. He stopped in the doorway. I did not rise at once. Not because I forgot respect, because the look on his face told me something had happened below stairs, and anything I said standing would have sounded too much like challenge. "Well?" I asked instead. He shut the dressing room door behind him. Pike had shown my sister a draft list of assets. A selective one. That is tiresome. She thought so too. That surprised me enough that I set down the papers. He came farther in. The strain had not left him, but something had changed around it. Less blind haste. More direction. Anne asked why the silver reserve had been valued separately from the rest of the plate. Pike said it was old family caution and attempted to move on. She did not let him. I could imagine it. Miss Ashdown had written in a lively hand and underlined with the impatience of a woman long accustomed to hearing only part of what was said in her presence. I had seen enough daughters of houses to know the type, softly dressed, more intelligent than the men negotiating them preferred. "And then," I said. Then I interrupted. Effectively. How grateful he must have been. At that his mouth moved almost into a smile, but it faded before it could settle. "Anne knows only that my aunt left some private obligations not yet fully understood, and that I would rather she heard from me than from Pike. She has agreed to leave the matter until this evening. That is more grace than many brothers receive. She says if I am protecting her, I had better improve at it." There it was. The family resemblance, then not in features but in line of attack. I liked her a little more for it, though liking had very little place in the room just then. He saw the open packet on my lap. "And you. I have found why the Countess wanted Anne ignorant only until her future was secure." I held out the draft. He took it, read the heading, and went very still. Not theatrically. He simply stopped spending any motion he did not need. I had begun to learn that this was his truest sign of alarm. When he reached the Countess's note in the margin, he read it once, then again. "Burden but stable. Wrong order. Silver reserve." "So," he said quietly, "the reserve was not merely savings. No, it was appearance, a negotiating strength. Insurance against the sort of question that begins politely and ends with a lady sent home humiliated." His eyes remained on the page. "And if the reserve is already partially spoken for by these hidden obligations, then Anne's position becomes weaker if the arrangement is named at the wrong moment by the wrong mouth." He folded the page back over the note without damaging it. You were right. I try not to make a public habit of it. He looked up. Rainlight from the window touched one side of his face, the other left in the softer dimness of the room. He seemed more tired than he had an hour ago. Less defended too, though that may only have been my growing familiarity with the shape of his strain. Paik wished to prepare summaries before dinner, he said. Of course he did. I told him nothing leaves the original papers now. Did he enjoy that? That is heartening. This time it did smile. Briefly, unwillingly, enough to change him more than was fair. He crossed to the dressing table, set down the settlement draft, and began examining the remaining papers with care rather than speed. That was new. He had stopped wanting only answers and begun wanting the rote to them. I watched him a moment longer than I ought. He noticed, not by vanity, by the slight turning of his head and the even slighter pause of his hand over the next packet. What? He said. You are reading more slowly. Is that a fault? No, merely progress. He looked down at the packet again. And you are watching me as though I were an instructional text. Perhaps you are. That seems a poor use of your afternoon. I do not know. Men who inherit trouble and discover they cannot command it out of existence are rather educational ball. He made that soft breath which I had begun, against my better judgment, to enjoy. Mrs. Vale, you are intolerable, and yet improving your methods by the quarter hour. We worked then without speaking for several minutes, the sort of work in which the air changes, because two people have stopped performing independence and begun instead to trust the other not to break the line of thought. He opened drawers and read correspondence headers. I sorted match dates and marked repeating initials. Once he passed me a folded bill without asking whether I had finished the last page. Once I handed him a household inventory before he requested it because I knew from the way he had turned the previous sheet what he needed next. Practical things. Dangerous things. Perhaps, because they are how regard first clothes itself among people too busy or too proud to call it by name. A second knock came, lighter this time. Before I could rise, Lord Westmere had already crossed the room. He did not open the door. He merely stood near enough to it that his voice carried clearly. Yes, Mrs. Bryce answered from the corridor. Your sister sent up tea, my lord, and asked whether Mrs. Vale prefers seed cake or plain bread. That made me look at him. He looked back once over his shoulder, one brow lifted very slightly, as if to say, there, you see, the house is adapting whether we wish it or not. Seed cake, I said. He relayed it through the door without alteration. When the tray arrived a moment later, he took it himself from Mrs. Bryce, instead of permitting the housekeeper even the half-glance she would surely have used to assess the state of our proximity, our papers, and our manners. He shut the door again with the tray in hand. That, more than the tray, told me he understood the cost of witnesses. He set it down on the small round table by the fire. I assume, he said, that choosing seed cake over plain bread has some hidden female significance I am not meant to understand. It means only that your sister has been well brought up and knows a working woman deserves sugar if she is to save her family from itself. At that he gave me the larger slice. I took it without remark, because remarking would have made it weightier than either of us wished. Even so, I noticed. Of course I noticed. We ate standing over the tea tray, among legal drafts and hidden accounts and rain-muted light, as if Hartcombe had already ceased to know how proper distances were meant to be kept when truth was under examination. After a time he said, if Anne's possible settlement and these obligations are tied to the same reserve, then my aunt was not merely preserving two women from separate harms. No, I said. She was managing the order in which the harms were allowed to become visible. He set down his cup. That sounds inhuman. No, only female. His eyes came to mine at once. I went on because it was true and therefore easier than retreat. A woman with limited power does not often prevent catastrophe. She sequences it. He did not answer. The room held the sentence between us like another document opened flat. Then, more quietly than before, he said, my aunt must have been very certain my father would do nothing if left to himself. And perhaps equally certain that I should hate learning it. That second yes cost more to say. He turned away first, toward the window, cup still in hand. The rain had lessened again. Water traveled down the glass in long thin paths, bending the view of the south lawn into wavering bands of green and gray. When this is over, he said, not looking at me, Hartcombe will not be what it was. I am not sure Hartcombe has been what it claimed for some years. That is usually how claims work, and you always sound so pleased to be right. I set down my plate. Not pleased, only unsurprised. He turned then. Is that how you survive people? By being unsurprised by the worst of them. The question should not have felt intimate, it did. I survive them, I said, by learning what they mean before I rely on what they say. He held my gaze a moment too long. Then someone passed in the corridor outside and the spell, if it had been one, broke at once. He moved back to the table, gathered the settlement draft and the Countess's note and said, in his ordinary voice again, we continue, Wes. I said. And because the afternoon had not yet finished narrowing around us, and because the house was no kinder than the weather, and because a woman in a cottage near the mill road depended on the speed of our understanding, we did. The note arrived on blue-edged paper, and with the wrong sort of haste. Mrs. Bryce herself brought it, which told me before it was opened that the message belonged neither to ordinary family feeling nor to ordinary household routine. She entered without ceremony once Lord Westmere had unlatched the door, crossed to him, and placed the folded sheet in his hand with an expression that suggested the news inside was unwelcome but not surprising. Miss Ashdown asked that you read it at once, my lord. He broke the wafer and scanned the page. Nothing in his face altered greatly. A fraction only. Inel, I said. He handed it to me. It was in Anna's hand, more hurried than the notes I had found in the dressing-room drawer. The Beaumont party had changed their route because the lower road toward Matlock was said to be worsening with flood and carriage damage. Rather than wait another 2 days at an inn, they meant to arrive tomorrow shortly after noon and take a cold collation if dinner could not be sensibly arranged. Anne added, beneath this, in a line pressed harder into the paper than the rest, if this is not convenient, I assume convenience is no longer a family virtue. I folded the note again. That is earlier than expected, I said. Mrs. Bryce stood waiting, practical as ever. Shall I begin the blue saloon, my lord, or the morning room? The blue saloon, he said at once. And the dining room. The morning room stays shut. West, my lord, she hesitated. Miss Ashdown also asked whether the silver candelabra from the west cabinet are to be brought down. By there it was again. Silver. Reserve. Appearance disguised as hospitality. Lord Westmere did not answer immediately. I said, no. Both of them looked at me. Mrs. Bryce's brow rose by the smallest degree. Lord Westmere's expression remained unreadable, but the pause had shifted now. It was no longer his alone. The western pieces will invite comment, I said. If your visitors have any skill in valuation, they will wonder why those particular items have emerged now and not at the funeral table or the condolence dinners. Better a room slightly less brilliant than a room that smells of stage management. Mrs. Bryce considered me the way one might consider an unfamiliar knife and decide, against instinct, that it has been sharpened by a competent hand. My lord, she said. The eastern set, he answered. And no pieces from the reserve cabinet. Mrs. Bryce inclined her head. Very good. As she withdrew, closing the door softly behind her, Lord Westmere said nothing until her steps had faded. Then, you answer my housekeeper very freely. She asked the room, I said. I happen to be standing in it. That is an impressive theory of rank. It is an impressive weak for abandoning weaker ones. He ought perhaps to have rebuked me. Instead, he crossed to the writing table and put Anne's note beside the settlement draft. Tomorrow, he said. We have until tomorrow. I knew. We have until tonight. Tomorrow the house belongs to witnesses. His gaze lifted at once and fixed on mine. It was one of the differences between us that he still thought in terms of hours remaining while I thought in terms of hours lost to performance. Once guests arrived, every corridor altered its use. Every servant became a possible listener. Every closed door acquired a meaning. There would be no truth in such a house. Only strategy. He nodded once. Then tonight, I moved to the small round table, where the remains of the tea stood cooling. My eye had been caught, while Mrs. Bryce was present, by nothing more than a fold of blotting paper set beneath the tray to protect the polish. Now, with the tray shifted, I saw on its edge a dark crescent where heat had browned the corner. I lifted it. Underneath, half obscured by the tray ring in the blotter, was a penciled line in the Countess's hand. Not a full note. Barely words at all. Upper schoolroom chess, you old inventories, if be. Before Pike I held the paper flatter to the light. Lord Westmere came nearer. What is it? I pointed. He bent to read. His shoulder brushed mine this time, not because either of us had forgotten ourselves, but because the room had become too small for caution and paper at once. I smelled rain again on his coat, though it had nearly dried. He smelled of damp wool, black tea, and the colder edge of strain. Upper schoolroom, he said. There is no schoolroom in use now. No, which is likely why she chose it. He read the penciled line again. Before Pike. She knew he would press her. Or search ahead of her. Or both. He straightened and looked toward the ceiling, as if the upper part of the house might become visible by force of need. The old schoolroom is in the east attic range. It was closed after my sister came out and the governess rooms were stripped. Closed how? A key was kept. Then lost. Then neglected. He looked back at the line. There may still be a chest there. There may also be dust, mice, and 30 years of bad economy. You improve every plan. I save them from false expectations. He took up the candle from the dressing table. Then let us go and be disappointed properly. We left the Countess' rooms together. The papers I had found in the dressing room restored for the moment to the wardrobe shelf, Anne's note folded into his pocket, and the small penciled instruction carried in mine. The corridor outside lay empty, but the house had already changed its pulse. Doors stood open below stairs. Somewhere linen was being shaken out. I heard the distant movement of chairs in the blue saloon, and the quicker rhythm of servants crossing and recrossing the main staircase with purpose. Guests reorder a house before they ever arrive. Lord Westmere did not take the principal stair. Instead, he turned through the old nursery passage, narrower and less ornamented, where the carpet gave way to painted boards and the walls held faint rectangles showing where framed prints had once hung. The farther east we went, the more the house seemed to remember practical uses no one now named aloud. A press for school cloaks. A bench beneath a high window. Hooks too small for adults' hats. A chalk mark, almost scrubbed away near one doorpost at a child's shoulder height. He saw me notice it. My sister used to be measured there, he said. My aunt kept the record because my father never thought to. And now, no, the mark remains and the paper has likely gone. That seems to be the family habit. He accepted the thrust. At the turn of the upper passage, the air sharpened with colder dust. The old schoolroom door stood at the end, painted the same respectable cream as the rest and rendered more forbidding for it. No grand lock, only a plain brass one gone dark with years. Lord Westmere tried the handle. Lost key, he said. There are hairpins downstairs. He looked at me. What? You say that as you have done such work before. I have been poor, my lord, not ornamental. A something like laughter escaped him then, brief and low enough not to break the hush of the upper floor. It altered him more than any smile had done, because it was unguarded and therefore costlier. I felt the sound in my chest with ridiculous clarity and immediately despised myself for noticing. We shall try without hairpins first, he said. He set down the candle, crouched, and examined the lock. I held the light lower for him. The passage narrowed around us. Outside, rain worked gently at the attic panes. Inside, the whole top of the house seemed to be holding its breath. This one has not been picked recently, he said. That is a comfort. It may also mean the chest inside is empty. That is less comforting. He glanced up once, quickly. You are very near my shoulder. The candle requires it, course. The lock resisted him a while and then, after a patient pressure with a narrower key from his watch chain, gave with a faint hard click. He rose. Neither of us moved at once. There are moments when opening a long, shut room feels indecent, even if one's purpose is clean. The air behind such doors belongs to other years, other voices, other patterns of use. One disturbs more than dust by entering. He opened it. The smell came first. Dry slate, old paper, stale wool, and the faint ghost of chalk. The room itself was larger than I had expected, with a long bank of east-facing windows now filmed gray by weather and neglect. One wall still held 2 maps rolled upon rods. A cupboard stood ajar near the hearth. Small chairs had been stacked in one corner, and near the far wall beneath a faded alphabet border, half hidden beneath old inventory sheets and a discarded screen, sat a cedar chest bound with dull brass. No emice, no immediate disappointment. Only a room that had once held children's stillness, trained into learning, now surrendered to the second life of houses, storage, forgetting, and concealment. I crossed first to the chest, then stopped when I saw the layer over it more clearly. The inventory sheets had been disturbed, not recently enough to show bright creases, but not left untouched for years either. One corner was folded under, another had been reversed and put back in the wrong direction. Small signs, but signs nonetheless. He found this room before us, I said. Lord Westmere shut the door behind him. Pike, or someone else who reads inventories and dislikes dust less than honesty. We stood looking at the chest. He came to stand beside me. You are shivering. It is cold. That was not an answer. It was sufficient, and he removed his gloves and held one hand briefly toward the dead schoolroom grate, as if habit still expected heat where once there had been a fire. Then, with a motion so matter of fact I nearly missed its kindness by mistaking it for efficiency, he lifted the folded wool traveling rug from the abandoned screen and set it about my shoulders before I could protest. My lord, I said, you may be indignant after we open the chest. I am not indignant. No. No, I said, more quietly than I intended. He looked at me once, not long, enough. Then he bent to the chest. It was not locked. That more than anything made my stomach tighten. He lifted the lid. Inside lay no jewels, scandalous portrait miniatures, no cache of love letters tied in theatrical despair, only paper. Bundles of it, schoolroom accounts, old inventories, copybooks, a packet of childish sketches tied in green ribbon, a flattened ledger with a scorched corner, and beneath these, set apart in a japanned document box no wider than a folio, a stack of letters sealed but unaddressed. Lord Westmere touched the scorched ledger edge first. Burnt, he said, perhaps saved from a fire, or from a grate, or interrupted halfway into one. He drew the ledger out. The blackened corner had taken only part of the back leaves. The front still held entries. I opened it while he lifted the document box free. The hand in the ledger was not the countess's, not the house steward's either. Tighter, male. The sort of hand a gentleman learns who keeps accounts unwillingly and not well enough to love them. I turned the page. household reserve allocations, private no household inspection, silver, plate insurance, temporary schooling disbursement Hale, Larkin, books, Buxton lodging, physician after confinement, confinement. The word lay in the middle of the page like a dropped blade. Lord Westmere, seeing my face, came round the edge of the chest. What? I placed my finger on the entry. He read. Everything in him altered and went hard at once. Not rage. That would have been easier. This was something colder, more exact. The moment a man sees his father's cowardice itemized not as rumor, not as accusation, but as expenditure. For one instant neither of us said a word. Then, very carefully, as if he feared roughness might break not paper, but the whole delicate, awful structure of the truth, he opened the Japan box. On the topmost sealed letter, in the late Countess's hand, were 4 words. For Westmere if necessary. The rug slipped a little from one shoulder. He noticed and put it right without seeming to know he had done so. His fingers brushed the back of my neck through my gown's collar. Warm. Brief, entirely accidental perhaps. It sent a line of awareness through me so sharp I hated it. Necessary, he said. He looked from the letters to the ledger to the closed schoolroom door. Tomorrow, he said, the Beaumonts arrive. And tonight we read this. His voice lowered further. All of it, there was no grandeur in the vow, no melodrama, only choice. It seemed to me then that the whole house had narrowed to this: an attic room, a box of sealed letters, the smell of old chalk, the touch of rain against high glass, and a man who had finally ceased trying to inherit Hartcombe cheaply. I looked down at the ledger once more. Larkin. Confinement. The Countess had not only sequenced women's ruin. She had been paying against it line by line while the family still called itself orderly. We cannot do it here, I said. The candle is poor, the room too cold, and if anyone notices the upper passage disturbed before dinner, they will wonder. He shut the Japan box. Then we carry it down. I glanced at the door. Together, he said, and because the worst of truth some demand the simplest forms of trust first. I took one side of the box while he took the other. Chapter 3: Rumor at the Dining Table. By 7 o'clock I was sitting at Hartcombe's round dining table beneath the blue silk shades, with a silver fork in my hand and every servant in the room trying not to look astonished. That, more than the soup, told me the evening had gone badly already. I ought not to have been there. A paid widow sorting papers for a noble family does not usually dine with that family unless she is a relation too poor to refuse the invitation or a dependent too awkward to hide. I was neither. I had intended, when we came down from the old schoolroom with the Japan box between us, to eat whatever Mrs. Bryce chose to send upstairs and continue with the letters in private. Lord Westmere had intended something similar, I think, but Anne Ashdown had sent word that if the papers touched her future, she would not sit below stairs like a decorative idiot while the truth was portioned out over her head. That was her phrase, decorative idiot. Her brother had tried, unsuccessfully, to persuade her to choose another. So here we were. Anne sat at his right in pale blue silk, the exact shade, I thought, of a clear summer promise made too early in the year. She was pretty in the way some young ladies are when they have always been expected to become more so under observation. Fine eyes, delicate features, a mouth a little too quick for perfect docility. She had her aunt's capacity for order and none of her patience. I liked her at once and knew it was dangerous. Mr. Pike sat opposite her, dark-coated, smooth-faced, and as polished as a legal argument about to conceal expense beneath civility. He had not objected to my presence aloud. That would have been clumsy. Instead, he had bowed over my chair with such exact propriety that the insult became almost elegant. Lord Westmere sat between us all and looked what he was, a man spending authority faster than comfort in order to keep a room from splitting. No one mentioned that he had placed me not at the far end of the table with the lesser candles and the weaker sight line, but nearer the center where I could hear and be heard. No one mentioned it because everyone had seen it, the servants most of all. Soup was set down. Spoons lifted. Footsteps withdrew. Hartcombe's dining room was not grand by the standards of houses meant to impress London. It had been built to assure Derbyshire that the family knew exactly what degree of importance was proper and would not disgrace themselves by pretending to more. Dark paneling. Good portraits. Plate chosen for age as much as shine. Tonight the candles made the blue shades above us glow like cooled flame. Rain moved intermittently against the windows, too fine now for drama, just enough to make every pane a listening surface. Anne broke first. Mr. Pike has informed me, she said, that the Beaumonts now mean to arrive tomorrow before luncheon, which I consider hateful of them and entirely like them. He has also informed me that Hartcombe must appear calm. Then, I said before I could stop myself, Hartcombe ought to send a refusal at once. Anne looked at me, then laughed. It was not a light laugh. It had edge in it, relief and strain together. Mrs. Vale, I begin to understand why my brother has not yet thrown you from the nearest window. Only because the windows are original, said Lord Westmere, and expensive. Mr. Pike's smile remained where it was, which was to say nowhere worth naming. One hopes, he said. That by tomorrow all parties at this table will remember the distinction between wit and prudence. Do you make it often? Anne asked sweetly. That was enough to silence him for 3 breaths. The fish came. A footman set my plate down with hands so careful that I could tell he had already retold the seating arrangement twice in his head, and planned to improve it once he reached the servants' hall. Not salaciously, perhaps. Not yet. But astonishment feeds well without sauce. Lord Westmore thanked no one for the dish, and no one minded. Men in mourning are allowed to forget small graces if their incomes are large enough. Anne broke her bread and said, My brother tells me only that our aunt maintained private obligations. Mrs. Vale has apparently become indispensable to understanding them. Mr. Pike thinks I need not know more until certain matters are settled. I dislike all 3 facts for different reasons. Miss Ashdown, said Pike. What I think is that partial information delivered under agitation often creates damage disproportionate to its value. I never heard ignorance described so handsomely, I said. His eyes turned to me. Mrs. Vale, I am certain your skill with papers is considerable, but you are new to Hartcombe. You cannot yet be expected to understand how delicately a family's future must be handled. There it was. Not open dismissal. Worse. The sort of sentence men use when they wish to remind a woman of salary, class, and the exact cost of overreaching, all while sounding as though they merely regret the burden of her limitations. Before I could answer, Lord Westmore said, Mrs. Vale understands exactly as much as I require. The line fell cleanly. Anne's knife paused over her fish. Pike's expression altered almost too little to see. At the sideboard, one of the footmen looked very briefly at the other and then away again. Witness. Always witness. I drank a little wine, though I had not meant to. It was excellent and therefore wasted on the moment. Mr. Pike recovered first. Of course, my lord. I spoke only of sequencing. As do I, said Lord Westmore. That ought perhaps to have ended it. Instead, it made the whole room more alert. Altered behavior is sometimes less dangerous than altered allegiance, and I saw at once that Pike had registered it exactly for what it was: flirtation, not softness, but authority extended. In a house like Hartcombe, that could be more scandalous than either. Anne saw it too. She did not look at me. She looked at her brother, then at Pike, then back to her plate, where she arranged her peas into a neater crescent than they deserved. How interesting, she said. No one asked in what way. By the time the remove came in, the room had settled into that polished state in which every sentence becomes a test of whether the previous one will be acknowledged, repaired, or sharpened. Lord Westmore asked Anne whether the blue saloon curtains had been aired. Anne replied that they had, though the room still looked like false cheer arranged by undertakers. Pike observed that first impressions mattered. I said that first impressions formed in bad weather were generally dishonest. Anne asked whether that was true of people as well as rooms. I said yes. Lord Westmore looked at his glass rather than at me, which was wise, because had he looked up too quickly, one or both of us might have appeared to be continuing a private conversation in public, and the servants had already enough meat for the evening. Then the silver appeared, not the reserve pieces. Thank heaven. The Eastern set as ordered, old enough to look respectable, ordinary enough not to invite valuation by hungry eyes. I noticed it because I had told Mrs. Bryce to avoid the Western candelabra, and because Lord Westmore noticed that I had noticed. He gave no sign except the smallest inclination of his head when the candles were placed. Acknowledgement. Nothing. Anne saw that too. Her fork came to rest. I am beginning, she said, to feel quite left behind in my own house. You are not left behind, said her brother. No. Then why does Mrs. Vale know what silver may safely be shown to my future in-laws while I must sit grateful for fragments? The word future hung there, colder than the rain on the window glass. Pike said gently, Miss Ashdown, there is no reason to assume any connection between household presentation and the matter under review. I turned my head and looked at him. He looked back. The man had a good face for lies. That is to say, he arranged sincerity well, but he spoke too quickly when separation would serve him. There may be every reason, I said. Anne's eyes came to me at once. Lord Westmore set down his knife. Mrs. Val. It was a warning, though not a harsh one. I heard in it 3 things at once: said not here, not yet, and do not make me choose between truth and my sister's composure at table. I answered with the smallest nod I could manage without making submission out of it. Pike took the opening at once. Speculation is precisely what we must avoid. Our present concern is only that tomorrow's visit proceed without visible disorder. Visible disorder, Anne repeated. What an ambitious standard for this family. For the first time, Pike's patience showed strain. Miss Ashdown, if your brother and I are working to preserve your position, I should be grateful if you would not treat the matter as a jest. The room went still. Anne did not flush. She did not lower her eyes. She only turned her head and looked at him with such perfect stillness that even the maid entering with the next dish slowed by half a step. My position. Anne said. Would be much easier to preserve if everyone in this house would cease discussing it as though I were deaf, decorative, or both, Lord Westmere said quietly. No, she said, still looking at Pike. I should like very much to know whether the family has been concealing ordinary debt, extraordinary debt, bastards, murder, or merely the usual blend of shame and male convenience. The maid nearly dropped the dish. Not outwardly. That would have been vulgar. But the spoon struck porcelain once and rang. There it was. The moment a private room ceases to be private even before the door opens. Pike's face hardened at last. Miss Ashdown, this is intolerable. Then tell me something tolerable. I had seen enough dinner tables in enough houses to know that once a young lady speaks the word bastards before the second remove, the servants' hall will have a full anatomy of the family before the cloth is drawn. Lord Westmere knew it too. He rose. Not quickly. He did nothing quickly when it mattered. He only stood. And that was enough. Anne fell silent. Pike rose an instant after him because etiquette required it and because men such as Pike always prefer to make necessity resemble form. This meal is finished, said Lord Westmere. Anne, you and I will speak in the Blue Saloon. Mr. Pike, remain here 5 minutes and then join us. Mrs. Vales. He stopped. One word. My name would have been too much in the servants' hearing. No word at all too little. The pause lasted a fraction. Then he chose the narrowest path through it. Mrs. Vale will return to the morning room. Pike's eyes flicked to me, then to him, sharp. Measuring, there and gone. Anne had not missed it, nor had I. As the servants moved to pull back chairs, she said very softly, how remarkably useful Mrs. Vale has become. There was no malice in it. Only though. That made it worse. I rose. My napkin lay folded beside my plate like any lady's. I wished very much it did not. At the sideboard one of the footmen avoided my face so scrupulously that I knew with certainty he would describe the entire scene to the housemaid before the next quarter hour was out. We had not yet lost the room. But we had certainly lost the evening. At the door, as Anne passed her brother, she said without looking at either of us, if Mrs. Vale has spent the afternoon hunting family skeletons with you through locked rooms, I suggest you tell me before Mr. Pike does it for you. She went out. Pike remained. Lord Westmere did not move. Neither did I. For one suspended second the three of us stood in the dining room among half-finished plates, dying candles, and the unmistakable scent of fresh rumor. Mr. Pike was the first to speak. He did not raise his voice. Men such as he never do unless they are certain the noise will profit them. Instead he remained beside his chair, one hand resting lightly on its carved back, and said, My lord, this cannot continue. Lord Westmere turned his head very slightly. You are 5 minutes early. That is because the damage has already begun. I ought perhaps to have gone at once when Anne left the room. That would have been modest, sensible, also foolish. A woman who departs exactly when a solicitor wishes to speak of her has conceded half the case before a word is said. So I remained where I was, one hand on the back of my chair, the other still holding my napkin because I had not yet thought what to do with it. Lord Westmere's voice stayed level. If you have something to say it plainly. Mr. Pike inclined his head. Very well. Mrs. Vale's usefulness may be considerable. Her proximity is another matter. There are insults and there are classifications. This was the second sort, the more dangerous one, because it pretends the speaker has risen above insult into principle. I laid the napkin down beside my plate. Mr. Pike, if you mean to call me improper, you may at least spare the sentence its waistcoat. His eyes came to me. I mean, he said, that there are appearances a house in present circumstances cannot afford. Then Hartcombe should perhaps stop arranging them so theatrically. He ignored that, which was cowardly but practiced. Your sister has already drawn her own conclusions, my lord. The servants surely more. And tomorrow, said Lord Westmere, will not be improved by your speaking of my housekeeper and footmen as though they were Parliament. Pike's expression did not alter. Yet I saw the small tightening near one eye that told me he had been checked more sharply than he liked. What I am speaking of, he said. His risk. Everything in this house is risk, I said. That is what happens when gentlemen call disorder prudence until the bills begin to answer back. That was when he turned fully toward me, and I understood at once that he had been waiting not merely for a breach but for a particular one. He reached inside his coat and withdrew a folded paper. My difficulty, Mrs. Vale, he said, is not with your tone, though heaven knows it is laborious enough. It is with the question of how you came by certain habits of this family's secrecy long before Lord Westmere ever set eyes on you. The room seemed to narrow. Lord Westmere's gaze went to the paper in Pike's hand, then to my face. I knew before the sheet was opened that it would be bad. There are some knowledges which arrive not through intellect but through the body. My skin went cool. My pulse did not climb. It seemed rather to draw inward and wait. Pike unfolded the sheet with unnecessary care. Schedule, he said. Found some months ago among Lady Westmere's retained correspondence. I thought little of it then except that it related to one of her tiresome private arrangements. This afternoon, however, while Mrs. Vale was kind to annotate several packets for my later review, I had occasion to notice the similarity of hand. He held the page out, not to me but to Lord Westmere. His lordship took it. I did not need to see it to know. Still, I saw the moment recognition landed in him. Not recognition of content first, of script, of alignment, of the slope of a certain capital and the compressed neatness of a woman who had once been paid by the sheet. The hand was mine. Of course it was. Not the free hand I used now, but the older one, straighter, more submissive, better suited to copying what one was not to own. Lord Westmere did not look up immediately. "When was this found?" he asked. "In January," said Pike. "And why did you not mention it this morning?" "Because until this afternoon I had no reason to connect it to Mrs. Vale. There are sentences which sound entirely plausible until one lifts them. This was one. He had likely connected it sooner, or half connected it and waited until connection could be converted into leverage. Men of his sort do not rush a useful revelation." Lord Westmere looked up then, not at Pike, at me. The room was still. The servants had withdrawn at last, thank heaven, but not before enough had happened to feed them well. The dining-room doors stood half open to the passage. Somewhere beyond, a board creaked. "Witness without body. House without face. Mrs. Vale," he said. I had known this moment would come in some form, the outline of it at least. Not the precise paper perhaps, but the shape he proved ceasing to be abstract. My handwriting becoming fact in another man's hand. Yet knowledge does not make exposure gentler. I drew breath. "Yes," I said. Pike moved slightly, no more than a legal mind adjusting itself to better advantage. "You admit it then?" "I am not blind, Mr. Pike. That is not the question." "No," I said. "The question is whether you prefer truth in useful sequence or scandal in triumphant disorder." But his mouth thinned. "My preference is for honesty." "Then you ought to have begun much earlier," Lord Westmere said, quietly and with more steel than before. "Enough." It silenced both of us. He laid Pike's schedule on the table very flat. "How long years?" "How many?" 6, perhaps 7. I did not count the date by future catastrophe. Pike gave a small sound through his nose, disapproval translated into breath. "That is a very graceful evasion." I turned to him with all the politeness I could gather and none to spare. "You are welcome to try widowhood and see whether the calendar behaves more clearly after it." That landed. Not because he cared, because Lord Westmere did. His eyes shifted once over my face, and then away, which was worse than if he had stared. He was fitting the word widow now not as fact only, but as context he had not bothered, until this instant, to inhabit. "When my husband died," I said, because the sentence had opened and there was no retrieving it without looking smaller than I wished. "I copied legal and household papers for several families who preferred discreet hands and lower fees. One of those commissions passed through Lady Westmere. I did not enter Hartcombe. I was sent pages. A copy was paid." Lord Westmere asked, "By whom?" There it was. Not an impossible question. A dangerous one. "The Countess's maid once, a steward's clerk another time, once through a relation of the rector's wife. I was not received into confidence, my lord. Only employment." "Convenient," said Pike. "Profoundly," I replied. "As starvation usually is." He looked as though he wished very much to find me coarse. I was quite willing to help him. Lord Westmere remained focused on me. "And you never thought to mention this before?" I could have lied then. Not well, perhaps, but with enough softness to make the lie resemble embarrassment. A lesser woman might have. Wiser one too, I thought, I said. To mention what I knew once I knew it in a form that did not sound like purchased gossip dragged in for my own safety. His expression changed by so little that anyone less attentive would have missed it. Yet I saw the offense in him, the involuntary one, before reason could school it. Not because I had lied. Because I had not trusted him. That was the sharper wound. Pike saw it too. "Of course he did, my lord," he said. "Surely you perceive how impossible this makes her position. Whatever her present intentions, she comes to the matter contaminated. She has been in the machinery before. Perhaps on behalf of the late Countess. Perhaps on behalf of someone else. We cannot know. But we do know that she withheld her prior connection while urging you toward conclusions of the gravest family consequence. There are moments when a man's argument is so neat one hates it for the quality of the stitching." Lord Westmere did not answer him. He was still looking at me. "Did you know," he asked, "when you first saw the copied letter in the morning room, that the hand was yours? Did you know then what it signified? You knew enough to conceal the schedule slip. That one struck harder because it was true." I said nothing. Pike stepped in at once. "You see," Lord Westmere turned his head by a fraction. "Mr. Pike, if you interrupt again, I shall send you." I was not loud. It was absolute. Pike bowed. "As you wish, my lord." I did not thank him for the defense because it was no defense. It was merely control preserved in a room determined to lose it. "You concealed the slip," he repeated to me, "because I knew what it was to have a single strip of paper decide whether one ate next quarter. Because I had seen too many men touch facts only to flatten them into convenience. Because your face, when you entered the room this morning, was the face of a man already half besieged, and I had not yet decided whether you would cut women loose to save silver. Because the old hand in that letter felt like my own shame returned with a title upon it. I said none of that. I did not yet know whom to trust with it. I answered. The words were quiet, entirely true, entirely insufficient. His mouth hardened. There are truths which sound like accusation even when spoken gently. This was one. Pike folded his hands behind his back. My lord. Yes, said Lord Westmere, without looking at him. Fear. The room seemed colder now than the weather warranted. From the passage came the faint movement of someone not moving far enough away. A servant. A maid, perhaps. Hartcombe itself listening at the seam. Anne's voice sounded then from the blue saloon. Not near but not distant either. Christopher. No one answered at once. Come in, said Lord Westmere. That more than anything proved how bad the moment had become. If he had wished to spare her still, he would have gone to her. Instead, he allowed her into it. Anne entered with the speed of a woman who has been excluded once already and has decided not to grant anyone the chance to do it twice. She stopped inside the door. Her eyes moved from her brother to Pike to me, then to the open paper on the table. What now? No one spoke. She came nearer. Pike made a movement as if to intercept her and thought better of it when Lord Westmere did not so much as turn his head. Anne reached the table and looked down. I watched the knowledge strike her not as it had struck her brother. He had gone still. She sharpened. This is Mrs. Vale's hand, she said. Yes. Not even a question. I had been writing labels and cross-references in the morning room half the day. Of course she knew it. Of course Pike knew she would know it. Apparently, she said into the silence. Our family now employs women already trained in its concealments. It was not cruelly said. That made it worse. I looked at her. Miss Ashdown, if you think I came here to protect myself by feeding on your house, you are wrong. Her gaze met mine directly. Then why did you not tell us at once? Because need teaches silence faster than morality teaches disclosure. Because I have spent too long in rooms where gentlemen first decide whether a woman can be trusted and only afterward whether she has been wronged. Because once, years ago, I took money to copy a page and did not ask what hole in the world the page had been meant to cover. And when I recognized this morning it felt less like evidence than like complicity returning to collect its debt. Again I said none of it fully. I told myself, I said, that knowing the hand was mine did not yet mean I understood the machinery around it. I wanted fact before confession. Anne's eyes stayed on me. And did you imagine confession would improve with waiting? No, I said. Only its usefulness. Lord Westmere turned then, at last, fully away from the paper and toward the room. That is enough for tonight, he said. Pike spoke immediately. My lord, on the contrary, tonight is precisely when decisions. It is enough, said Lord Westmere again. Pike bowed but did not retreat this time. As you wish, yet I must state for the integrity of the estate that from this point forward any document touched, identified, or interpreted by Mrs. Vale will be vulnerable to challenge. He had chosen the word carefully. Not propriety, not scandal, estate, money furways. Anne said, and yet you waited until dinner to produce it. But Pike's face tightened. Because I was attempting to avoid a scene. Anne looked at the half-clable, the open doors, the exposed schedule in my hand, and then at me. You failed. She was right. The room held that truth for several breaths. Then Lord Westmere said, with a restraint now so tight it seemed to hum under the candlelight, Mr. Pike, leave us. A Pike did not move at once. No. He gathered his paper copies with visible care, bowed to Anne, to me, and lastly to Lord Westmere, though the last bow contained the least grace of the three. At the door he paused just long enough to say, My lord, I hope you will remember before morning that houses are not saved by sentiment. No one's gone. Everyone spoke. And remained standing. I remained where I was. Lord Westmere stood at the head of the table with one hand resting against the carved wood, and looked, not angry now, but wounded in the most dangerous way privately. He said at last without looking at either of us, Mrs. Vale, I think you had better tell us everything you are willing to tell. Not everything I was willing. Not everything there was. The distinction stood between us like another witness. Everything I was willing to tell. Not everything there was. Anne said, how generous. Her brother did not rebuke her. That, more than the words themselves, told me how far the ground had shifted. I folded my hands before me because they wished to do otherwise. Very well, I said. Years ago, after my husband died, I copied household and legal papers for families who preferred discretion to regular clerks and lower fees to pride. Some of that work came indirectly from your aunt. Pages were sent out. Pages were returned. I was not told the whole of any matter, and I did not ask enough questions when asking them might have cost me the work. Anne had gone very still. Lord Westmere said, you recognized the hand this morning. Anne said nothing. Her brother's face altered by almost nothing. Yet I felt the strike of it all the same. Anne said, You mean to tell me you have been walking through my aunt's rooms all day, discovering papers linked to this house, and chose silence because silence suited you best? No, I said. I chose silence because I did not yet know whether recognition amounted to guilt, usefulness, or merely old shame returning in a fresh dress. That startled her enough to soften the line of her mouth, though only for an instant. Lord Westmer asked. And the schedule slip. I concealed it. Yes, we are past that. There are moments when a sentence's brevity does more violence than its volume could. I looked at him. I concealed it because once years ago, I would have been paid to copy such a thing and then forgotten. This morning I did not know whether your first instinct would be to understand the arrangement or cut it away before it touched your sister's prospects. Anne drew breath sharply. He did not. That was worse. The candles moved in the draught from the passage. Blue shades above us, wet glass at the windows. Half-finished dinner congealing under silver covers. Hartcombe listening at every seam. At length he said, "So you judged me before you spoke." Anne gave a short, bitter laugh. "Excellent. We are all very frank at last." "No," said her brother. "Not yet." The line in his voice made her fall silent. He looked at me with an exactness I had not yet seen in him, not even in the morning room when he first laid the packet flat beneath his hand. There had been fatigue then, curiosity, need. Now there was injury disciplined into inquiry. "How much did you know of my father?" he asked. "Nothing directly. Did you know his name was connected to the arrangement? But you suspected." "That was answer enough," Anne said, more quietly now. "Why?" "Because women are not usually hidden through rectors and apothecaries for sentimental reasons," I said. "Because school fees are not maintained in secret for unrelated girls unless someone fears what full acknowledgement would expose. Because your aunt's memoranda were written in the language of management, not benevolence." "And still you said nothing," said Anne. "I said nothing," I replied, "until I had paper enough to know whether I was condemning a dead man fairly or merely helping the living find a sacrifice convenient enough to carry." Lord Westmer turned away from me then and put one hand against the back of his chair, as though to steady himself not physically but socially, to preserve the room from the shape his thoughts might otherwise take in it. And watched him. Not that, too, altered things. A sister will forgive a stranger's concealment more readily than her brother's shaken face. Not because the concealment matters less, but because blood is the first mirror anyone truly fears. She asked. The question was not addressed to me. It was to the room, to the meal, to the air my brother and Mrs. Vale have shared all day and thought I would accept in fragments because I wear silk and may be sold with plate. I answered anyway. "There is a widow in a cottage beyond the mill road," I said, "and a girl nearly 12 whose schooling was maintained under hidden entries. The Countess paid, the rector forwarded, and your father did not name them." Anne's face emptied, not into innocence, into mathematics. "Money?" she asked. There it was at last. No sentimental recoil, no fluttered horror, only the right question. "The silver reserve?" I said. "At least in part. Your aunt's notes tied the schoolroom matter to it and to your settlement draft." Her eyes moved at once to her brother. He said, "Anne, no." "Is that true?" Only one word. Yet it settled more heavily than any speech he had made all evening. Anne's hand went to the edge of the table and closed there. Then the Beaumont visit was moved forward into the middle of a lie, a managed truth. I said before I could stop myself. She looked at me sharply. "Do not improve it." I was not improving it, but only naming its sex. That nearly made her laugh and nearly made her cry. Instead, she stood perfectly upright and said, "So while my aunt was preserving some child in a cottage, she was also preserving me for market." "No," said her brother at once. "Not for market." Anne turned on him with sudden force. "What should I call it, Christopher? A tender inquiry into whether Hartcombe's silver shines honestly enough to support my future. A devotional interest in my character. Do not dress it better than it is merely because it has happened to us before." Her voice had risen, not beyond control but beyond private room safety. A servant in the passage would hear, too, if they had sense enough to linger. I saw Lord Westmer hear that too. His gaze went to the doors, then back to her. No. Do not Anne me. Not now." He crossed to her in 2 strides and lowered his voice. "You may say everything you like, but not where the house can carry it before dawn." She looked up at him, breathing quickly. "The house already knows." "Wes," he said. "Not all of it." That calmed her more than comfort would have done. She had his aunt's gift for order after all, not obedience sequence. When she spoke again, her tone was lower. "So if the reserve is weakened, the Beaumonts ask questions. And if the child is named publicly, they ask uglier ones. And Mrs. Vale knew enough this morning to fear you might choose me over them." The words hung there. He looked at me then. For one instant I thought he might deny it out of wounded pride alone, not because the denial would be true. He did not. "I might have," he said. "Honesty, once paid for dearly enough, tends to arrive in ugly clothes." Anne closed her eyes briefly. "Well," she said, "that is at least worth hearing. It was not absolution. It was only reality received. I had expected his confession to help me. Instead it did the opposite. For if he might have cut them loose this morning, and I had judged him for it, then what did make me now after a day spent trusting him with papers, rooms, and my own old hand in brown ink, not vindicated, only implicated in a slower shift of faith? Lord Westmore turned from his sister to me. You should have told me, not because you owed me confidence, because you owed the truth its proper order. That struck harder than anger would have done. I know. No, he said. I do not think you do. Because if you had trusted me badly and been wrong, that would have been one injury. But you trusted me not at all and decided alone which facts I might bear. That is another, Anne said quietly. Christopher. He did not look at her, I said, because there was no use now in dressing Herta's argument. Yes. The word came more gently than I wished. I hated that too. He went to the sideboard where the family keys had been left during dinner, among the wine labels and folded napery, and took up the ring which included the morning room key, the blue cabinet key, and two others I had not yet had cause to identify. Then he held out his hand. For a moment I did not understand. Then I did. The morning room key was in my reticule, the Countess's smaller key in my cuff pocket still. The very metal of the afternoon's trust. Anne saw it at once. Of course she did. Christopher, she said again, sharper now. He answered without taking his eyes from me. Until I know where trust failed first. Trust failed first. Not in the dead father's ledger. Not in Pike's patience. Not in the house's centuries of sequence and concealment. Here. Between us. That was what he meant. I took the keys out one by one and placed them in his palm. The brass made almost no sound. Yet in that room it seemed louder than Anne's raised voice had been. The house had altered again. No longer collaborator then. Not quite. Not after the cottage. Not after the schoolroom chest. But no longer unquestioned either. Useful, yes. Necessary perhaps. Also compromised. A woman whose hand appeared in old concealments and whose judgment had run ahead of disclosure. A woman who could now be kept near or put aside as convenience and caution required. His fingers closed over the keys. It ought to have made me angry first. Instead it made me cold. Anne said, if you remove her now, Pike wins. I am not removing her. It looks very like it. It looks, he said, finally turning to his sister, like what it is. I have papers touched by my father's cowardice, my aunt's management, Pike's patience, and Mrs. Vale's prior silence. I will not pretend the line between help and hazard has not altered, because pretending is easier at table. There it was again. The line between help and hazard. I had crossed it, perhaps long before Hartcombe. Tonight only made the crossing visible. Anne's gaze came to me, and for the first time since entering the room I saw not wit or wounded pride there, but something nearer pity. I disliked it at once. I see, she said. No one did, of course. Not fully. The door between dining room and passage stood ajar by perhaps 3 inches. Through it I saw only carpet and shadow. Yet I knew with perfect certainty that the shape of our silence would travel farther by midnight than any direct statement we made. Useful woman at table. Brother defending her. Solicitor producing paper. Keys taken back. One does not need complete truth to make a house move around a story. Only sequence and appetite. Lord Westmore put the key ring into his coat pocket and said very formally, now, Anne, you will go to the Blue Saloon and receive the Beaumonts tomorrow exactly as planned. Nothing changes publicly before we decide it does. Privately, he said. Everything changes. He looked at me then, and because the keys were gone the look landed differently that might have an hour earlier. Not command, not appeal. Something harder to endure. A man still needing what he no longer felt able to trust cleanly. Mrs. Vale, he said. I should be obliged if you would join me in the morning room. Obliged. Not asked. Not ordered. Worse than either. I inclined my head because there was nothing in me just then fit for speech. Anne moved first. At the door she paused and looked back. Not at her brother. At me. If you mean to leave us in the dark after this, she said, do it soon. I should rather know tonight whether you are cowardly, compromised, or merely tired. Then she went out. The words remained after her like perfume of a brutal sort. Cowardly. Compromised, merely tired. Lord Westmore waited until her steps had faded. Then, without looking at me, he said, come. I followed him out of the dining room and up the stairs, through passages now half alive with servant motion and half arrested by the knowledge that something had shifted under the roof. A maid carrying folded and flattened herself against the wall to let us pass. Thomas, crossing from the library, looked down at once and too late. Mrs. Bryce emerged from the housekeeper's room just in time to see us in single line, he ahead, I behind, neither speaking. Her face did not change. That more than open curiosity made me understand how far the evening had already traveled. The morning room door stood open. He entered first. I followed. He shut it behind me and turned the key. The sound ought not to have startled me. He had locked this room before. I had locked it myself. Yet tonight the key no longer meant protection from the house. It meant exclusion measured and controlled by his hand rather than mine. He crossed to the desk and laid the ring upon it, the brass pieces striking wood with a hard, small sound. I remained where I was. The candles had been trimmed while we were downstairs. Their light was cleaner now, steadier. The papers on the desk looked as they had before dinner and entirely altered. The japanned box from the old schoolroom stood near the annuity book. The copied letter lay where we had left it. So did the private disbursement ledger with its scorched corner. Hartcombe's truths had not shifted by an inch, only the terms on which I stood among them. He did not immediately turn to face me. Instead, he stood with both hands braced on the blotter, head lowered a fraction, exactly as he had done earlier when the house seemed to have become larger than his breath. But this time there was no discovery in the gesture, only restraint. At last he said, "Sit down." That made him straighten. I had not raised my voice. I did not need to. There are refusals which arrive best when stripped of decoration. He turned then. "You think I mean to question you like a magistrate," he said. "I think you have just taken back every key you trusted me with and locked me into a room after your sister called me cowardly, compromised, or merely tired. I should say the magistrate is not far off." A line appeared beside his mouth. "Anne speaks too quickly when wounded. She is not alone in that." No. He looked at me very directly. "Nor you." Silence stood between us a moment. Then he said more quietly, "I did not bring you in here to humiliate you. Then your methods have outrun your intentions." That struck him. I saw it land and hated, even then, that some part of me kept count of what could wound him. Such knowledge is a kind of closeness, and I wanted none of it just then. Or rather, I wanted it far too much and therefore less than none. He moved away from the desk at last and to the fire, though he did not warm himself there. He rested one hand on the mantel instead and looked not at the coals but at the dark window above them. "I took the keys," he said, "because I could not have Pike thinking I meant to continue exactly as before." Then the gesture was for Pike. The room included me. Only one word. Entirely insufficient. I laughed, though there was no amusement in it. "How comforting." He turned back at once. "Would you rather I had left them in your possession and thereby given Pike grounds to say I valued my convenience over the integrity of the papers?" "I would rather," I said, "that you had not made me the visible correction for a house full of listeners." A pause. Then, very softly, "So would I. There are admissions which repair and admissions which merely prevent further damage." I could not tell in that instant which this was. He came back to the desk and this time pulled out the chair opposite. He did not sit. He only stood behind it with both hands resting on the carved top rail. I said, He began, "that you should tell us everything you were willing to tell. And I am now revising the sentence." That made me go still. "To what?" "To everything I need." There it was at last. The old shape of rank, not cruel, worse, necessary. I moved nearer the desk then, not to obey but because anger, if one means to use it properly, ought not be scattered across too much carpet. "What you need," I said, "and what I can rightly say are not the same. Then let us test where they differ." "No," I said, "you may test where they differ. I have been tested since the day I buried my husband and discovered the cost of every kindness afterward." Something in his face altered, not surprise exactly. He had heard enough of widowhood already to understand the outline. But the directness of it, perhaps, or the fact that I had finally ceased smoothing all the sharper corners for his comfort, struck him harder than he expected. "I am not your creditor," he said. "No, you are only a man with title, money, wounded trust, and a room full of papers which now make me useful and dangerous at once. That is very nearly the same species." His hands tightened slightly on the chair back. "You enjoy putting every man in the same dock." "Not every man. Only the ones who believe injury gives them clearer moral sight than women have under ordinary conditions." He stared at me. The candles moved faintly in the draught by the window. Rain had ceased for the moment. The silence after it felt thinner than before, as if the whole house were straining upward to hear what would happen in this room now that the polite part of the evening had failed. At length he said, "Very well." He left the chair and came round to the other side of the desk. Not to loom, not quite, but the shift was deliberate. No longer brother, host, or gentleman at table. Earl, head of the house, man to whom the consequences would attach first in law even if not first in guilt. "What precisely?" he asked. "Did you copy?" I looked at the japanned box. "You have the letters," I said. "Read them." "I shall." "That is not the question." I should have refused. I knew that even as the answer rose. "Instructions," I said. "Disbursement schedules. Household memoranda passed out in parts so that no one clerk saw the whole. Once, a note concerning the forwarding of books. Twice, figures broken into smaller sums to pass under different headings. And you never knew for whom." "Not certainly, but enough to suspect women. Enough to suspect a child." "Later, yes. Not at the beginning." He was quiet a moment. "Then who paid you?" "I have already told you." "You told me the routes. I want the name." I met his gaze. That surprise saw it. You refuse. Because she is dead. His expression hardened. That has not prevented us discussing my father. Your father left a child in concealment and let another woman pay the moral interest on it. I feel no urgency to preserve him. And the maid, I said, did what women in houses always do. She carried what was placed in her hand and knew enough not to be seen knowing more. She is dead too, if you must have the full account. I will not buy my present safety with a dead servant's name. He looked at me a long time after that. It was not an easy look to bear, because I could not tell whether he judged me disloyal to the truth or loyal to the wrong portion of it. At last he said, so there are still things you withhold. There are always things women withhold from great houses, I replied. That is how some of us remain alive. The line landed harder than I intended, or perhaps harder than he could permit himself to show. He turned away from me then and opened the Japan box. For several moments he said nothing, only sorted the letters by date with the methodical care of a man who has discovered that if he does not keep his hands disciplined, something far less disciplined may speak in their place. I watched him do it. There is an intimacy in watching another person read under strain. One sees which lines they avoid, which words they strike with a thumb afterward, as though the paper had bruised them, which silences they cannot immediately inhabit. I knew I ought not mark those things in him. I marked them anyway. He opened the first letter, the Countess's hand, clear, compressed. If this has reached you, circumstances have worsened beyond what I intended. The obligation was not mine in origin, only in conscience. You will be tempted to classify it as expense. Do not. Expense can be cut. This cannot unless you choose to inherit your father's character as well as his title. He read it once, then again. I looked away before he finished, because there are some griefs which become indecent if witnessed too closely by the wrong person. He opened the second. The girl must stay where she is until she can be removed upward rather than outward. Mr. Hale understands enough to keep the route clean. Anne must know nothing while the matter of her future remains uncertain, not because she is weak, but because men asked to price a girl will always price her family first. That one I heard because he read the last clause aloud without seeming to mean to. Price her family first. Yes, always. He set the letter down and let his fingers rest upon it a moment. I said quietly, your aunt did not flatter anyone. Nuke. His voice was flatter still. She economized in tenderness. There was more in the box. We read in silence for some time after that, he standing, I at last taking the chair because my knees were beginning to tremble and I would not have him see it. Not all the letters were equally explosive. Some dealt only in quarter sums, routs, and delays. But taken together they formed a complete enough shape, a dead earl's cowardice made durable through account books. A countess's decision to prevent its cost from falling wholly on the woman and child left below stairs in the social order. A sister kept innocent until marriage should secure her. An estate taught to mistake concealment for stability. By the fifth letter the room felt smaller. By the seventh, colder. By the ninth, Lord Westmere stopped reading. He set the page down very carefully beside the others and looked at the fire, not the paper. I said nothing. At length he asked, did you ever think, when you copied those schedules, that one day you might stand in the house itself and watch the son read what his father had cost other people? A pause. Did you feel pity for him? I ought perhaps to have answered with caution. Instead I told the truth. I did not think of him at all. He gave a short breath that held no amusement. No. Why should you? Why should I indeed? The son of a house is always someone in the future. The widow with unpaid rent is always someone in the present. He turned then and looked at me, not with anger now, but with a kind of exhausted exactness. And today, the question was dangerous. I might have parried it. Instead I said, today I think of him rather more than is useful. His face changed. Barely, yet enough that I wished at once I had chosen a lesser sentence. He did not step nearer, he'd not ask what I meant, made the moment stranger, not safer. At last he said, you should not. No, I said. I know. A silence again. The old house kept filling with it. Then he moved back to the desk and drew the key ring from his pocket. He looked at it once, then at me, and for one absurd hopeful instant I thought he meant to hand it back. He did not. He placed it beside the letters instead, not restored, only visible. I cannot yet return these, he said. Do not flatter yourself that I ask. I know you did not. That should have eased something. It did not. He continued, but I will not insult you by pretending the withdrawal was only for Pike. There, better, worse. I folded my hands in my lap. No, his gaze stayed on mine. Partly it was for him, partly for the house, partly because I needed to know whether, if all else in this room shifted, you would still tell me where the line truly lay. And did I? The answer came too quickly to be strategic. That startled both of us a little. He looked down at the letters. You lied by omission. You judged me. You concealed the slip. Yet when I pressed beyond what was mine to take, you refused me cleanly. I find I would rather have that than easy contrition. I had not expected understanding. Not tonight. It unsettled me more than anger had done. Then your standards are eccentric, I said. They are under revision. The line might almost have been light if the room had not been so full of damaged fathers, hidden payments, and the shape of other women's survival. I rose then because sitting any longer felt too much like staying. The chair legs made a small sound against the carpet. He watched me. I shall leave in the morning, I said. There, it was done. The sentence did not tremble. I was glad of that. A woman ought at least to choose the condition of her own departure if she can do little else. His expression did not change at once, which told me he had not expected it. The question came sharply enough that I almost smiled. Men so often say why as though it were the mysterious part. Because if I remain after tonight, I said, I become too easy a target and too difficult a defense. Pike will use me. The servants will talk. The Beaumonts will smell strain before the first plate is cleared. Anne will be asked to smile while the house stares past her at me. And you, I stopped. And I what? I made myself finish. You will be required to choose in public whether I am merely paid help, trusted ally, or suspicious convenience. None of those choices will improve tomorrow, he said, after a brief silence. You think leaving spares us? No. I think leaving at least clarifies the arrangement. And what of the papers? You have enough now to continue without me. That is not true. Wes, I said. It is. Mrs. Vale, you have the letters, the ledger, the settlement note, the route through Hale, the name Larkin, the understanding of how the reserve has been used. You no longer require my hand to point out what the paper itself now says. He came nearer then, not abruptly but with purpose enough that I felt the distance alter before I measured it. We stood on opposite sides of the desk no longer, only a chair's breadth apart, the letters and candlelight between us. You are wrong, he said. Am I? Yes. He lowered his voice, though no one could hear us through the locked door unless Hartcombe had grown ears in the keyhole. Because the paper is no longer all that is in question. There are moments when one knows very exactly that the next sentence must not be invited. I invited it all the same. What else? He looked at me with that same exhausted exactness as before, and because he was too tired now to be ornamental, the truth in him came out bare. Whether I can trust the person reading it beside me, he said. The line did not accuse. That made it unbearable. I answered after too long a pause. And your conclusion? That I can trust you with what is difficult, less with what is humiliating. His mouth tightened fractionally. I do not yet know whether that distinction will save us or ruin us. I laughed once, very softly, because if I did I might have done something worse. Then we are admirably matched, I said, for I think nearly the same of you. That struck him into stillness. And because the hour was already too stripped for pretense, I added, you are good under burden, less so under wounded pride. I do not yet know whether that distinction will save your house or ruin the women under it. He ought perhaps to have taken offense. Instead, he looked at me as though something in the room had just been named that neither of us could now pretend not to see. I see, he said at last. No, I replied. Not yet. The old phrase between us now, different in tone from the morning. Sharper, sadder, closer to truth. He stepped back first. That saved us. He put one hand on the desk, glanced once at the key ring beside the letters, then away again. If you mean to leave, I cannot stop you. I know. Will you tell Anne yourself? No. I think tonight she has earned rest more than explanation. He nodded. Then I shall tell her in the morning. There was dignity in that. And distance, useful things both. I looked at the papers once more. The copied letter in my old hand. The Countess's judgments. The ledger entries written by a dead man who had believed money could silence character if properly rutted. I had thought this room would end with confession and consequence. I had not expected it to end with departure, but perhaps that was vanity. Rooms seldom end where one wishes. Only where the last useful truth can bear to stand. I moved toward the door. His voice stopped me before I reached it. Mrs. Vale. I turned. The candles put his face half in light, half in shadow, tired, controlled, entirely too readable to me now. When you say morning, he said, do you mean after breakfast or before dawn? Before the house properly wakes. He absorbed that. Of course, he said. I put my hand on the door key. He said very quietly, you are wrong about one thing. I looked back. You are not easy to target. No comfort in the sentence. No plea. Only truth. And perhaps that was the crueler mercy. I answered with the nearest thing to grace I had left. Good night, my lord. He bowed his head once. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the corridor, where the house had gone hushed again after its evening's listening. Somewhere far below a servant crossed the hall. Somewhere nearer a floorboard settled. Hartcombe was putting itself to bed around its secrets, not yet knowing which of them would still be under its roof by breakfast. I closed the door behind me and did not look back. Before dawn, then, that was now the next true thing. Chapter 4, The Ledger Before Witnesses. By 4:30 the house had fallen into that peculiar silence which belongs neither to night nor morning but to the hour in which servants are beginning to wake and gentlefolk still pretend the world has not yet resumed its demands. I was dressed, cloaked, and packed. There is very little dignity in packing by candle before dawn in a borrowed chamber, especially when one means to leave a great house not from wounded romance, as novels would prefer, but from calculation, fatigue, and the plain desire not to become the most convenient object in another family's scandal. Still, I had done harder things with less light. My trunk was too large for stealth, so I left it. What I could carry I had folded into my traveling case as 2 gowns, my writing things, a shawl, gloves, the little purse of savings I never left unattended in strange houses, and my husband's prayer book, which I had not opened in months but still packed as though faith were a property that might return if kept near enough. I had written a short note for Mrs. Bryce and a shorter one for Anne. Neither said much. Women leaving houses seldom gain by eloquence. The third note remained unwritten, not because I did not know what to say to Lord Westmere. On the contrary, I knew too many things and trusted none of them well enough to leave upon paper. Outside, the rain had at last ceased. The east windows held that early, colorless pearl of first light which makes every room look more innocent than it deserves. I extinguished the candle, took up my case, and opened the chamber door. The corridor beyond lay empty. Good, I did not take the principal stair. Even at that hour one may meet a maid with coal, a footman with boots, a housekeeper with opinions. And I wished to encounter none of Hartcombe's hierarchy if I could help it. The nursery passage would bring me by the east stair and then, with luck, to the side door near the still room where the servants went out for herbs and milk. I had reached the turn by the old schoolroom before I saw light under the morning room door. I stopped, only for an instant, a candle I thought first, or 2. Someone up absurdly early and foolishly industrious. Mrs. Bryce, perhaps. Or Pake, returned to the scene of his injury with a legal conscience and an appetite for advantage. Then I saw the door itself, not shut, open by perhaps an inch. I stood with my case in my hand and felt that small hard turn in the chest, which means one is about to be taken again by a day one had already tried to leave. I ought to have gone on. That would have been the wise choice, the almost dignified one. Instead, I crossed the carpet runner and set my fingertips against the edge of the door. The morning room had changed back into a battlefield overnight. Letters lay open in a fan beside the Japan box. The annuity volume stood propped against the tea caddy as if one page had needed to be seen against another. The scorched private ledger had been open near the back where the burnt edges made the leaves stiff and blackened. On the Countess's desk, beneath the stronger light of 2 candles and the growing one from the eastern windows, Lord Westmere sat with his coat off, his neckcloth loosened, and one hand pressed against his mouth while the other held a final sheet. He had not slept. It showed not only in his face but in the room. A sleepless man's work always spreads differently. Less carefully, perhaps, more honestly. He heard the tiny movement of the door and looked up. For a second neither of us spoke. He did not appear surprised. That told me he had expected I might still come this way, or perhaps only hoped not to miss me if I did. Mrs. Vale, he said. No title could have sounded more tired. I ought to have answered with equal formality and gone no farther than the threshold. Instead, I said, "You are awake early. I have been awake all night." That is less admirable. Probably. He looked then at the traveling case in my hand. His gaze did not drop to it in accusation. That would have been easier. It only rested there, took the fact of it in, and lifted again to my face. "So," he said quietly, "before dawn after all." I tightened my fingers on the handle. "I told you as much." He set down the sheet in his hand but did not rise. I said, "I had not expected an audience. I did not mean to provide one." A pause. "Come in." That seemed to cost him something like a wince, though a very small and dignified one. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "if you go now, you will leave in ignorance. I have endured worse conditions." The words were soft enough that they might have passed, had I wished. For pity. I did not wish. Not from at this hour. Not with my case already packed. He reached for the topmost page on the desk and held it up just enough for me to see the familiar compressed hand of the late Countess. I found the missing link. That made me go still. Not because curiosity outweighed pride. I should like to flatter myself it was not so simple. But one does not spend a day tracing hidden obligations through ledgers, rectors, and dead fathers only to walk away cleanly when the final paper appears. "What sort of link?" I asked. "The kind," he said. "That makes leaving now a poorer decision than you deserve to make in ignorance." I disliked him for the sentence. That, too, was inconvenient. Still, after a moment, I crossed the threshold and shut the door behind me. The room smelled of cold tea, candle grease, damp wool long since dried, and paper handled too often by exhausted fingers. He had been through every letter in the box. Some twice, I thought. The Countess's script appeared in piles now arranged not merely by date but by argument. Hauserve, Larkin Hale, Anne. One stack by itself. I set down my traveling case by the wall and remained standing. He took up the separated stack and offered me the first page. I did not immediately take it. Will this be a test? That would be a novelty. Yes, he said. Let us experiment. I took the page. The Countess had written it not as instruction but as record. No address, no politeness, only a private memorandum in the curt exact style of a woman who knew softness encourages future revisions. It must be remembered, should Christopher inherit before the matter is regularized, that Miriam was not first wronged by his father. She was wronged by the house, the cottage, the schoolroom allowance, and the reserve payments are all one account, though men will prefer to split them into separate shames, because separate shames are cheaper to dismiss. I read it once and again. Wronged by the house. Not only by his father. I looked up. Lord Westmore was watching me not for comprehension, but for what the line did to me. I imagine my face showed enough. There is more, he said. Of course there was. I took the next page. Larkin was promised advancement and the tenancy if he would marry quietly and remove the girl from the lower village before gossip fixed itself. He was led to think the child might pass as is if enough distance and money were applied. He drank the bargain more easily than he ought, but bargains made upward are rarely free. When he died, the old arrangement could not be allowed to fail without exposing first the woman, then the child, and finally Anne's portion to questions of character and inheritance which would have swallowed all three. I lowered the page very slowly. For a moment the room seemed to shift around the facts, not because they were sensational in the vulgar way. Worse than that. They were structural, no single seduction, no isolated hush-money scheme. A whole house using tenancy, distance, marriage, and maintenance as tools to absorb a man's wrongdoing until it hardened into system. The cottage, the schooling, Anne's portion, I said. She was right, it is one account. He rose then, not abruptly, he had no energy left for abruptness. Yet the fact of his standing altered the room all the same. He came round the edge of the desk and stopped at a distance that was careful not because it was large but because it had been measured. My father wronged Miriam, he said. My grandfather's steward, under my grandfather's knowledge if these older notes are read correctly, arranged the tenancy and marriage to bury the first stage of it. The Countess, my aunt, spent years keeping the worst of that structure from falling on the two easiest bodies, Miriam and the girl. And because the reserve was also the cleanest shield for Anne's future, she bound the sums together and prayed, I imagine, for time. His mouth tightened on the last word. Time, I said, is what every great house buys when it cannot afford justice. He did not argue. I looked back down at the paper. Larkin had married quietly, removed the girl from the lower village, passes as if enough distance and money were applied. No romance at all then. No hidden favorite. Only a woman processed through family convenience until shame became architecture. The case by the wall looked suddenly smaller. I set the pages down with care. What do you mean to do? He answered without hesitation. Not what Pike would advise. That narrows little. It narrows enough. He picked up another letter, then changed his mind and let it fall back to the desk. He would separate the questions, one for Anna's settlement, one for the reserve, one for Miriam, one for the child. He would say each may be solved on its own merits. The Countess wrote last night's answer before any of us reached it. Separate shames are cheaper to dismiss. And you. I think, he said, very evenly, that the house has been dismissing them cheaply for 2 generations. Now that was not eloquence. It was better. It was decision. Still, I asked, and if acknowledging the whole account damages Anne, he looked at the papers, not me. Then the damage must fall first where it belongs. On me. On the estate. On the name. Not on her. Not on Miriam. Not on the girl. That was the worst of it. Or perhaps the best. Either way, it rendered my packed case beside the wall absurd. He seemed to see the thought pass over me. Because he said, after a brief silence, you judged me yesterday morning not entirely unfairly. That is almost gracious. It is not grace, it is chronology. His gaze came back to mine. You were right that I might have cut the matter down to save my sister's prospects. Yesterday morning I still thought in columns. By midnight the columns had acquired faces. There are apologies that ask to be accepted and apologies that simply lay down their own evidence. This was the second sort, I said. That is a dangerous improvement. Another pause. The east windows had grown brighter while we read. Dawn was fully at work now, flattening candlelight and making every sheet on the desk look harsher, cleaner, less romantic than the night before. Good. Romance had done nothing useful in this house. He looked at the traveling case again. I can stop you physically only by disgracing us both, he said. So I shall not attempt it. How kind. It is not kindness. He took up the Countess's memorandum and held it once more between finger and thumb. It is strategy. Also honesty. If you leave now, Pike regains the ground he lost. He will divide the matter before breakfast, soothe Anne by luncheon, and present the Beaumonts a house in which every visible inconvenience has been arranged into silence. Miriam and the girl will receive money a quarter longer perhaps. Then the route will begin to narrow. Then vanish. Not because anyone has chosen cruelty exactly. Because men choose solvency and call the result necessity. I hated how precisely he said it. And if I stay, then I ask you, he said, to help me do what my aunt failed to complete. That did not move me as it might have, had he said it beautifully. He did not. He said it like a man asking for labor under oath. Still, I asked, what precisely? I tell Anne the whole of it. He began counting not on his fingers but in the air between us, as though building columns again, only honestly this time. I remove the reserve from any false appearance of free family comfort. I declare the annuity route openly within the legal structure of the estate rather than under household concealment. I place Miriam and the girl where support no longer depends on servants' rectors, or the moods of male descendants. I let the Beaumont visit go badly if it must, and I do not let Pike decide which half-truth is cheapest. That was not nothing. It was also ruinous, or near enough. You would do all that today. No. But I begin today. I looked at him steadily. And where, in this admirable sequence, do you imagine I stand? He gave the question the respect of thought. Then will you have stood from the first, only more honestly named? Which is? He did not answer immediately. I was almost grateful. A poorer man would have rushed to the word ally as if that settled all injury. He did not insult either of us so cheaply. At present, he said, indispensable witness, intolerable conscience, and the only person in this house who can tell me when I am arranging convenience to resemble virtue. I could not help it. Not much. Enough. That is a very ugly employment. Yes, he said. I fear I offer poor terms. Your fee is dreadful, da. I can improve the fee. That is the least persuasive part of you. A breath, almost a smile. I had begun to suspect it. But the room shifted then, though not into ease, merely into something less brittle. Not trust restored. Trust altered into a shape both of us could perhaps stand to use. I said. You took back the keys. You cannot undo that by candor. You cannot ask me to forget the spectacle of it for Pike's benefit. You cannot even be certain I would not walk out 10 minutes from now and leave you to your admirable principles. No, he said again. His face had gone very still by the end of it. Not closed. Braced. I crossed to the desk. The key ring lay near the scorched ledger, ordinary and heavy and stupidly eloquent. I touched none of it. Instead, I laid my fingers on the Countess's memorandum. I stay, I said. For Miriam Larkin and the girl. For Miss Ashdown if she will have my bluntness. And because I prefer not to see your solicitor win before breakfast. I do not stay because you have persuaded me that your judgment is now infallible. His expression changed not into relief, exactly. Into something sharper and stranger, as though the line I had drawn had steadied him more than any forgiveness might have. I should distrust you if you did, he said. That is fortunate. A distrust appears to be one of our stronger mutual accomplishments. The east light climbed another degree. Somewhere below stairs a bell rang, faint but distinct. The house was waking now in earnest. Fires would be stirred, water carried, shoes brushed. Mrs. Bryce would soon learn whether my chamber bed had been slept in after all. I glanced toward my case by the wall. He followed the glance. I assume, he said, that the case is a reproach. It is a reminder. Of what? That departure remained possible until 5 minutes ago. He inclined his head. Then I am grateful to have arrived before it ceased to be. The words were too near gratitude, and because of that I set them aside at once. Very well, I said. Miss Ashdown first. He nodded. Before Pike. Before breakfast, ideally. Pride behaves worst when fed. That earned me the briefest true smile of the morning and vanished again. Then he reached for the key ring. My breath caught before I could prevent it. He saw. Of course he did. He did not hand it to me immediately. He only held it a moment between us, the brass gone dull in the growing day. Said last night, he said, that I could not yet return these. I can return one, not all. One. Honest again. He separated the morning room key from the ring and placed it on the blotter before me, not into my palm, not as if nothing had happened, not as private softness, as were. I looked the small piece of brass, then at him. This is not absolution, he said. No, I replied. It is method. I picked it up. The metal was cold. Good. Cold things are easier to trust than warm ones at dawn. From the corridor came the first clear tread of a servant beginning the day in earnest. I turned toward the door. Then let us wake the house properly. We found Anne in the small breakfast parlor off the East Gallery, already dressed and far too composed for the hour. A tray stood before her untouched except for the coffee. The maid who had brought it had been dismissed, to judge by the second cup set ready in the absence of any servant hovering at the door for orders. Morning light, still thin and colorless, lay across the carpet and the pale china alike, making everything look cleaner than the day deserved. Anne sat with one hand around the handle of the coffee pot and the other resting on a folded visiting list. She had changed from last night's silk into a morning gown of dove, gray muslin with narrow blue trimming at the sleeves. Her hair had not been fully dressed. That softened her. It also made her look younger, which in turn made the sharpness in her face more striking. When Lord Westmore opened the door, she looked first at him and then at me. "You are both awake," she said. "How heartening." Her brother shut the door behind us. Wes," she said. "I know, we are all very tired, and I am to behave as if I had not been partially lied to by my family, my solicitor, and the woman at my table in one evening. Sit down, both of you, or I shall feel theatrical, and none of us has leisure for it." There was enough of their aunt in the line that I nearly smiled. Lord Westmore drew out a chair for her without thinking, then remembered she was already seated and stopped short with the smallest expression of annoyance at himself. He took the chair opposite instead. I remained standing a moment longer than either of them, because entering family breakfasts with legal secrets in one's head is not a habit one acquires gracefully. Anne looked at me. "Mrs. Vale, if you hover, I shall assume you mean to vanish. I should prefer to be disappointed after coffee rather than before." So I sat. Lord Westmore had brought the Countess's letters in a leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. He set it on the table beside the coffee tray and did not open it at once. Anne noticed. She asked. "No," said her brother. "Wes," I said at the same time. They both looked at me. "Because," I said, "the truth arrives no better on an empty stomach, and because your brother already sounds as if he means to turn this into a pronouncement." Anne, to my relief, did smile at that. She poured for all three of us. The coffee was strong enough to count as moral instruction. No one took sugar. Lord Westmore waited until the cups were set down. "Anne," he said, "I have spent the night with the letters from the Japan box and the older account books from the schoolroom chest. What we suspected yesterday is now clear enough that half-truths would do more damage than help." Anne did not interrupt him. That, more than her stillness, told me she had braced herself properly. He took out the first memorandum, the one in which the Countess had written that Miriam was wronged by the house, and not merely by his father, and laid it between them. She read quickly, faster than he had, faster than I had the first time. Her eyes did not move beautifully over the page as ladies in portraits pretend to read. They moved like a person sorting what must be felt now from what may be survived later. When she reached the line about separate shames being cheaper to dismiss, she stopped. Then she read the page again. At last she looked up. "So," she said very quietly, "it is not merely my father." "Then no," said her brother. "It is the family, the estate, the house." He did not answer that one immediately. I did. Anne set the paper down with care. She did not cry. She did not redden. She did not ask whether the woman had been pretty or whether the Countess had hated her or whether any one of the 100 lesser questions might soften the true ugliness by making it more intimate and less structural. Instead, she said, "If I understand this correctly, my marriage portion has been protected partly by the same reserve that kept another woman hidden at the edge of our land." "Wes," said Lord Westmore. "And if the reserve is shown thin or irregular, the Beaumonts ask why. And if they ask why before we choose how the answer is spoken. Miriam Larkin and her daughter are the first to pay." She sat very still after that. Then she looked at me. "And you knew this yesterday?" "I knew enough to fear it," I said. "Not enough to state it cleanly. That is an answer designed not to improve my temper. It is the truest one I have." Anne took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, touched the Countess's memorandum with one fingertip, not as if it were precious but as if she wished to confirm the paper was real, and not some theatrical trick created for Dawn. Then she said, "How much money?" There it was again. Not tears, figures. Lord Westmore drew out the settlement draft and the reserve notes. "The reserve itself is larger than the hidden quarterly payments. The danger is not absolute insufficiency. It is the appearance of divided use." Anne let out one soft breath. "Appearance. How I hate that word." "A's do hate that bow," said her brother. "No," she replied. "You hate the burden of it. Women are taught the grammar younger." That shut him up for a moment, which did him good, I said. The Countess knew that too. That is why she wrote of the wrong order. She was preserving two things at once. The continuation of support and your freedom from being priced against family irregularity before you had any secure position from which to withstand it. Anne looked down at the settlement pages again. "So I am not merely collateral, I am timing, Wes," I said, "and therefore important, but not decorative." At that she gave me a sharp sidelong glance which held humor, offense, and recognition in equal parts. "You are very irritating before breakfast. I improve after luncheon." "No, you do not," said her brother. That might almost have been ordinary had the pages between us not been what they were. Anne read the margin note again. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling as if somewhere in the plaster there remained a version of her aunt sensible enough to explain why all families must contrive become both ridiculous and cruel in the same generation. Finally she said, "Very well. Then the Beaumonts must not be allowed to think they are admiring stable silver when they are in fact admiring concealed damage." Lord Westmore's head lifted at once. She looked at him. "Do not begin." But if I am to be sold, I should at least know the catalog. No one is selling you. Then stopped speaking of my future as though it were a room to be staged. Her voice remained low. Oh. That was what made it cut. You may call it settlement, prospect, suitability, or alliance. Men always change the word when the price offends them. I saw him absorb that and not answer, which again did him good. I said, because someone had to pull the thing from moral language back into sequence before it broke apart. What matters this morning is not whether the Beaumonts deserve your candor. They do not. What matters is whether we can afford their ignorance until we have moved the legal ground beneath them. Anne looked at me with that quick, clever severity of hers. Can we, perhaps, I said, if we stop thinking only of silver? Lord Westmer said, go on. So I did. There are at least 3 separate questions, I said. 1. The support to Miriam and the girl must be made lawful within the estate and not dependent on hidden roots. 2. The reserve must cease to be the sole elegant surface by which this house appears more liquid than it is. 3. Your future, I looked at Anne, must be removed from the category of false reassurance. If the Beaumonts are to proceed, they must do so for the truth of Hartcombe, not a cleaner version invented overnight. Anne was silent a moment. Then, you mean I ought not to marry a man whose mother counts candelabra? Wes, I said, though I should have thought that self-evident. That depends how handsome the man is, she replied. Her brother made a sound which in another room might have become laughter and in this one became pain checked in time. Anne turned to him. Christopher, do not look tragic. I am not in love with Mr. Beaumont. I have met him twice and his chief distinction appears to be that he bows as if listening to invisible applause. Despite everything, that line restored a little color to the room. Lord Westmer said, the matter is not romance. No, said Anne. It is arithmetic and family smell. I understand that. She rose abruptly and crossed to the window with her cup in hand. Morning had grown stronger while we sat there. The lawns below shone with the remains of rain. Beyond them the south meadow lay pale green under a thin wash of mist. Hartcombe looked peaceful enough to lie convincingly to strangers before noon. Anne stood looking out for several braids. Then she said, still to the glass, what can be sold? That turned the room again, not away from feeling. Through Lord Westmer answered first, some horses. Which? The bays from the lower stable. No one will notice the bays except the groom, she said. That is not enough. He rose too, though he remained by the table. A carriage. The green traveling coach, I loathe it. A field lease. Which field? The west strip near the mill road. She turned at once. No, he frowned. Why? Because if you begin cutting land nearest the village at the same time as altering support to Miriam, you will draw eyes in the exact wrong direction. She set down her cup. Sell what hurts pride before what invites interpretation. I watched him hearing his sister, as if perhaps for the first time in the proper denomination. Not as a marriageable daughter of the house, nor as something fragile to be preserved from facts, but as another intelligence formed under the same roof and sharpened by different constraints. What then, he asked. Anne did not answer immediately. She crossed back to the table and looked down at the draft lists. Her finger moved over headings, furnishings plate, horses, timber, art. She stopped at the line for the Italian marble table in the West Saloon. She said, he stared. My mother's table. It has been in the family 30 years, and has given us nothing in return but shin bruises and pretension. Sell it. I could not help it. I laughed. Anne glanced at me. Do not encourage me. I have more. By all means continue, I said. So she did. 2 ormolu urns in the north gallery which no one liked but everyone had been taught to admire. The green traveling coach. 1 pair of matched greys too handsome for honest economy. Half the cellar of a claret her father had been preserving for an occasion grander than his character. The marble table. 3 pieces from the reserve cabinet to be sold quietly through London rather than displayed locally. A subscription to an absurd horticultural society the estate had been maintaining out of habit and masculine vanity. By the time she had finished, even Lord Westmer looked almost human. You have thought about this before, I said. Of course I have, she replied. Did you imagine women grow up in houses like this without learning what every object costs in silence? No one had a better answer than the truth of it. Lord Westmer went to the writing stand in the corner and took up paper. He wrote at once, fast and without ornament, as though he feared any pause might let old habits of concealment return before the ink dried. What are you doing? Asked Anne. Making a list, he said, before courage has time to become family feeling. That, too, was better than eloquence. I rose and came round behind his chair, not near enough to crowd but near enough to read upside down as he wrote. The items went down in a clean practical order. Sale, lease, withdrawal, trust conversion, solicitor to be instructed. Hail to be brought in by noon. Pike to produce full reserve schedule, not abstract. I said, not Pike alone. He kept writing. No, Mrs. Bryce. He looked up. If you mean the house to shift under this, you will need someone who knows which servants are loyal to decency and which only to hierarchy, Anne said. Mrs. Bryce knows all of them. Lord Westmore nodded once and added her name. There was something extraordinarily indecent, in a moral sense, about how quickly the room improved once the truth was no longer being shielded from the wrong people. Not easier, never cleaner. And because the day would not wait for our revelations to ripen into comfort, I said, the Beaumonts. Anne's expression sharpened again. Lord Westmore stopped writing. I went on. If they arrive at noon expecting to inspect a calm and prosperous house, then they must be received. That cannot now be avoided. The question is whether they leave with a fiction intact or a doubt planted, Anne said. I prefer the doubt. Wes, I said. So do I, but it must be the right sort. And that, said Lord Westmore, setting down the pen, is exactly why you are not leaving this morning. I looked at him. The sentence had not been spoken warmly, nor commandingly. It was simply laid there as fact. I said, I had not agreed yet. No, he replied. But you have now revised my sister's future, my furniture, my cellar, my household structure, and my sales strategy before 6 o'clock. That is not the behavior of a woman seriously committed to departure. Anne put in, also, if you leave me alone with both men, I shall either murder one of them or accept something stupid out of exhaustion. That is a point in favor of my staying, I admitted. It is an overwhelming point, she said. Lord Westmore's gaze remained on mine a moment longer than was prudent, especially in his sister's breakfast parlor with the Countess's memorandum lying open between the coffee cups. Nothing in it was tender, not yet. Only tired recognition and the faintest return of the trust we had both bruised the night before. Then he looked down and gathered the letters into order again. Very well, he said. Sequence. First, and here's the whole. Second, Mrs. Bryce. Third, Pike is given instruction rather than opportunity. Fourth, the Beaumonts may admire the wrong house. Anne lifted her cup once more. That sounds almost cheerful. It is not. No, she said. But it is preferable to yesterday. She drank, set the cup down, then looked at me with sudden directness. Mrs. Vale. Wes, if you ever again recognize your own hand in a scandal touching my house, I should prefer a faster confession. That is fair. And if you are to help me through today, I shall need from you one thing. What thing? An exact estimate, she said, of how much worse men are when they are hungry, frightened, and trying to appear well-bred. I consider. Twice as foolish, I said. 3 times as expensive, infinitely more tiresome. At that she laughed properly for the first time, and because her brother did too, briefly, against his will. Like a man who has forgotten laughter and found it by mistake, the room changed around us once again, not into innocence, never only into alliance. And with that, the day at last began in earnest. By noon the Blue Saloon had been made to look as though Hartcombe believed in itself again. The curtains had been opened to the fullest reach of the pale day. Fires burned in both grates, though the air no longer required them. The eastern silver had been brought down and polished without vanity. Flowers from the glasshouse stood in 2 bowls on the mantel and one narrower vase by Anna's elbow, as though the house had decided to admit spring only under supervision. Even the carpets looked more certain of their lineage. Great houses have a genius for recovering composure in public half an hour before collapse. I stood near the long console between the windows with a writing folio in my hands and the morning room key in my pocket, where it had rested all through breakfast like a small cold verdict softened into work. Mrs. Bryce moved between the sideboard and the door with the authority of one who had already decided the Beaumonts' character from the way their advance note had been folded. Mr. Hale had arrived at 11 on Lord Westmore's summons and now sat very upright in one of the smaller chairs, as if he feared his black coat might absorb too much of the room and be mistaken for rank. Mr. Pake stood by the fireplace with papers in hand and the patience of a man who had lost several arguments before breakfast and intended to recover them before luncheon. Anne sat where the light struck her cleanly and showed every line of her poise without allowing any of it to become decorative. She wore pale gray again, but a string of pearls had been added, not to make her marriageable, I thought, but to remind the room that she had not surrendered refinement merely because honesty had intruded upon the day. Lord Westmore stood near her chair, not hovering, not guarding, only placed where a brother and head of house ought to be placed when strangers came to weigh his family's worth without admitting it. He had not looked at me more than twice since breakfast. That was wise. Unfortunately, I noticed both times. The Beaumont carriage was heard before it was seen. Wheels on wet gravel, harness sound. The abrupt slowing of well-bred horses annoyed by country roads. Mrs. Bryce did not go to the window. Neither did I. Anne did, though only with her eyes. Then Thomas opened the door and announced them. Mrs. Beaumont entered first, which told me almost everything I needed before she spoke. She had the face of a woman who treated civility as a sort of polished instrument and had long since forgotten that it might once have had warmth in it. She was elegantly dressed, restrained without humility, and wore black only as much as courtesy to recent mourning required. Her son, Mr. Beaumont, followed. He was indeed handsome in the correct and rather empty way Anne had predicted: good shoulders, good boots, good hair, and the air of a man who had been taught from infancy to listen attentively whenever his future comfort was being discussed. With them came his married sister, Lady Evers, a pretty woman with sharp eyes and the practical gaze of one who had married into title and learned the accountancy beneath satin very well. Introductions were made, bows, curtsies, the first measured lies of welcome. Mrs. Beaumont expressed concern for the family's loss and satisfaction that the weather had improved enough to permit their route. Anne answered perfectly. Lord Westmere answered a degree more coolly than etiquette required. Mr. Beaumont looked at Anne as if relieved to find her both pretty and composed. Lady Evers looked at the room. I thought would count the silver. Tea was offered. Dick then accepted after all, which was a vulgarity disguised as delicacy. Mrs. Bryce gave no sign she noticed. I stood where I was not because I belonged among callers but because Lord Westmere had, before they arrived, told Thomas in a voice everyone in the room could hear that Mrs. Vale remains. There are moments in houses where one's place must be made by sentence rather than furniture. This was one. It did not make the position comfortable. Only plain. Mrs. Beaumont's eye came to me once briefly with the smooth curiosity of a woman adding an unexpected object to her internal inventory. Lord Westmere said before she could ask, Mrs. Vale is assisting with certain estate papers left in disorder by my aunt's death. Mrs. Beaumont smiled. How fortunate. No one in the room mistook her meaning. Mr. Pike, I noticed, had arranged himself precisely where he could intervene if the visit threatened to become too candid too soon. He had brought an abstract of the reserve figures. Of course he had. I saw the folded sheet in his hand and disliked him more for not even pretending to have left it in his case. The first 10 minutes passed in the formal way such visits do. Roads. Weather. The unfortunate state of the lower bridge. The Beaumont London season. Anne's health. Lord Westmere's tenants. Lady Evers asked whether Hartcombe still maintained the East Conservatory. Mrs. Bryce answered from the sideboard before Anne could be forced into domestic display, which made me like the housekeeper better with every passing quarter hour. Then Mrs. Beaumont's gaze moved, light as a finger, to the silver on the sideboard. You have always had such handsome pieces at Hartcombe, she said. That pair with the chased rims is quite charming. Family, I suppose. It was everything. Anne set down her cup very gently. Lord Westmere said, some of it. Mrs. Beaumont's smile did not alter. One values continuity, Wes, he said. So long as it is honestly paid for. There it was. Not a stumble, not a crack. A door opened by his own hand in the middle of the room. Mrs. Beaumont blinked very slightly. Mr. Beaumont's attention sharpened. Lady Evers looked from the silver to Lord Westmere and then, with admirable speed, to Anne. She understood social danger faster than her mother did. Mr. Pike moved at once. My lord, he said smoothly. Perhaps before luncheon you wish to review the reserve schedule with me in the library. No, said Lord Westmere. The word struck with such clean finality that even Thomas, standing by the door, seemed to stiffen. Lord Westmere turned to the Beaumonts. Before we proceed under any comfortable misunderstanding, there is a matter I will not stage around. Hartcombe is under revision. No one moved. Anne did not look at him. That was the bravest thing in the room. He went on. My late aunt maintains certain private obligations through household concealment rather than legal estate structure. Those obligations arose from old wrongs committed under this roof and have touched the reserve in ways I have only this morning fully understood. The reserve therefore cannot be represented as free family ease, nor will my sister's future be negotiated upon any such fiction. The saloon went utterly still. Mrs. Beaumont's cup remained halfway to the saucer and did not finish the journey. Mr. Beaumont looked not scandalized exactly, but blank in the manner of a man who has never before had the upholstery removed from a matrimonial visit while he sat upon it. Lady Evers did not blink at all. Mr. Pike said, My lord, surely this may be framed with greater precision in private. Lord Westmere turned his head. This is the greater precision. Mrs. Beaumont found her voice first. I confess I do not understand. That is my doing, he said. I am correcting it. Anne rose then. If she had remained seated, the whole thing might have looked like a brother's confession made to preserve her from some taint in which she had no share. Rising made her part of the truth, which was harder and far more useful. My mother's family, she said, raised me to believe that breeding lay in how one received unpleasant facts once they had become unavoidable. I hope they were not mistaken. That was beautifully said and entirely hers. Not soft, not dramatic, simply impossible for Mrs. Beaumont to answer without exposing more of her own character than politeness generally permits. Mrs. Beaumont set down her cup at last. Miss Ashdown, I should be very sorry if you imagine us ungenerous. I imagine nothing yet, said Anne. That is why my brother speaks before luncheon rather than after vows. I nearly smiled. Lady Evers, to my interest, did not retreat behind her mother's tone. She said, "You speak of obligations. Do you mean debt?" Lord Westmere answered her. "In part. More accurately, concealed support rutted privately where it ought long since to have been regularized openly by the estate. The sums are not ruinous. The concealment is." The Mrs. Beaumont's eyes moved to Mr. Pike as if solicitors existed to stop precisely this sort of nobility. Pike bowed a little, enough to acknowledge the glance and evade the responsibility. "And the nature of these obligations?" she asked. "There are questions one may answer truly and still destroy the wrong person with the truth." I felt that knowledge pass across the room before anyone spoke. Mr. Hale looked down at his hands. Mrs. Bryce did not move, though I saw at the edge of her apron the tightening of one thumb into the cloth. Anne said, very clearly, "A woman and her daughter were left dependent under our family's management. I will not have them made exhibit pieces for another family's scrutiny." Mrs. Beaumont's expression altered at once. There it was, scandal-scented, paternity guessed, calculations beginning. Mr. Beaumont flushed. Lady Evers did not. She only looked more attentively at Anne. Lord Westmere said before Mrs. Beaumont could speak, "No names will be discussed. That belongs neither to your rights nor to your curiosity. What belongs to you, if you mean to continue in our company, is this: Hartcombe will set the account in lawful order. Some objects long treated as symbols of household ease will be sold. Certain reserves will be reclassified. My sister will not be offered under false appearance. If that alters your view, better now." He did not sound grand. He sounded tired, exact, and dangerous in a way greater than anger. A man who has stopped bargaining with the truth usually does. Mrs. Beaumont sat very straight. "This is a most unusual declaration to make at such a moment, Wes," he said. "I cannot imagine who advised it." At that her eyes went to me. I met them, and was glad of the years in which landlords, parsons' wives, tradesmen, and pitying benefactors had all attempted in their different styles to make me shrink first. "It is a useful education. One learns not to." "I did," said Anne before I could answer anything at all. "And if the bluntness offends you, you may attribute the better half of it to my aunt's papers, and the worse half to me." There was a small pause after that in which I think Lady Evers revised her opinion of Anne upward by several degrees. Mr. Pike attempted one last recovery. "If I may place the matter in proper legal terms." "No," said Lord Westmere. Pike's face hardened. "My lord, you put the estate at needless disadvantage. My father and grandfather did that first." The line did not merely silence Pike. It changed the witness structure of the room. Until then, everyone had been hearing a nobleman announce difficulty. Now they heard him place the shame where it belonged. Not on a dead aunt's eccentricity. Not on a woman hidden beyond the mill road. On the mail line itself. That mattered. Mr. Hale lifted his head then and, perhaps because he understood suddenly that the hour required more than clerical passivity, said, "As parish witness, I can confirm only this much. Support has been maintained quietly for years where open acknowledgement was denied. Its withdrawal would now be an active wrong, not the mere ending of favor." Mrs. Beaumont turned to him with a stiffness that suggested she found clergymen useful only while they limited themselves to soup, death, and subscriptions. "And you are," she said, "Hale, rector of Hartcombe." He gave the title no extra polish. That too mattered. Mrs. Bryce spoke next. No one had invited her to. She did not appear to care. "The late countess," she said, hands folded before her apron, "kept separate inventories by her own direction and required certain pieces never be shifted from the reserve cabinet without written instruction. If his lordship now means to dispose of selected items and reset the household accounts, the house will support the change. Not I will support. The house will." That was an extraordinary sentence in a room such as this. It meant servants' order, household continuity, legitimacy of transition. It meant Hartcombe itself had chosen sides. Pike knew it. I saw the calculation fail in him by increments. Mrs. Beaumont had heard enough to understand the shape, if not the full body, of what sat before her. "Mr. Beaumont," she said to her son. "Perhaps we had better know," said Anne. The word came out so calm that it startled every person present. Anne remained standing by the tea table, one hand on its edge, the morning light at her shoulder and the pearls at her throat no longer decorative at all. "No," she repeated. "If your son means to leave, he may leave as a man, not as a parcel under maternal instruction. If he means to stay, he may stay under the same terms. But I will not be assessed while everyone pretends this is only weather and household taste." Mr. Beaumont flushed more deeply, yet to my surprise he did not retreat into his mother. He stood. He had not until then seemed likely to interest me. Beautiful men trained for polite inheritance often disappoint. This one still might. Yet the fact of his standing under his mother's visible disapproval earned him at least the dignity of a second look. "Miss Ashdown," he said, "I do not presume a right to the details, but I should not like to be thought a man who requires ladies traded under false accounts. Good. Better than I had expected. Not enough, perhaps, but not empty either." Mrs. Beaumont turned on him. "Edmund." He did not sit. Lady Evers said very dryly, "Mama, if the family means to be honest before luncheon, we may at least allow the same experiment in the next generation." That nearly finished her mother. Anne looked at Mr. Beaumont a moment, measuring not his jaw or boots or prospects but his tolerance for a room in which women had begun speaking in complete sentences. Then she said, "That is better. Not sufficient, but better." Mr. Beaumont inclined his head as though he knew a rebuke well earned when he heard it. Another point in his favor. Lord Westmore, seeing perhaps that the room had gone as far as it could without becoming theatre, took the last necessary step. "Very well," he said. "Here is the practical consequence. 3 items from the reserve cabinet will be sold through London. The green travelling coach, the marble table in the West Saloon, and other non-essential property will follow. A trust will be established this day for the support already owed. The reserve will be treated as charged, not free. Mr. Pike will prepare the legal instruments accordingly under my direction and with Mr. Hale as witness to the necessity of continuity. My sister's position will not rest upon hidden accounts. Mrs. Beaumont, Mr. Beaumont, if under those conditions you wish to withdraw, do so now with my full understanding and without discourtesy." He had staged it beautifully at last by refusing stagecraft entirely. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Mrs. Beaumont rose. There was no scene. Women of her sort do not make scenes in other people's houses unless they are certain the other people are weaker than themselves. Instead, she gave one of those cool, almost, smiles which mean she has been thwarted, offended, and forced into observing standards she had hoped to apply only outward. "My lord," she said, "I admire clarity even when I cannot admire timing. It did not seek admiration." He replied. "No," she said. "I begin to see that." As she turned to Anne, "Miss Ashdown, I should prefer not to answer for my whole family in a single room. My son may call later if he wishes. For my part, I think the present hour overfull." Anne gave her a curtsy of such faultless form that no one could accuse her of insolence and no one could miss it either. "I am sure the drive back will assist reflection." Lady Evers nearly smiled. Mr. Beaumont did not move at once. He looked at Anne. "May I write?" Anne, who until yesterday had been a daughter under negotiation and was now, before my eyes, revising herself into something less marketable and much more formidable, answered, "You may write honestly. I have no use for controversions." He bowed. "Then I shall try not to be kind in the wrong direction." That, I thought, was perhaps the best thing he had said all day. Mrs. Beaumont left first, Lady Evers behind her, and Mr. Beaumont last. At the door he paused and glanced back once at his mother's retreating figure, then at Anne, then at Lord Westmore. Not approval. Not approval. Assessment, human, at least. Then they were gone. The room did not at once relax. Rooms rarely do after moral surgery. Thomas closed the door softly behind the departed family. Somewhere in the hall another servant took up the relay of the news at once, I was sure. Yet what would travel now was not only scandal. It would be stranger and, to some, more incomprehensible. His lordship named the wrong as his own house's. Miss Ashdown did not faint. The rector spoke. Mrs. Bryce sided with the change. And the Beaumonts were sent out half courted and half rebuked before luncheon. Good. Let them carry that. Mr. Pike remained by the hearth with his papers in hand and looked, for the first time since I had known him, like a man forced to stand inside the consequences of choosing convenience too elegantly for too long. Lord Westmore turned to him. "You will draft the trust instrument now," Pike said. "My lord, there are still reputational ways to narrow the wording, without names." Pike tried again. "The structure becomes vulnerable in future claims. Then make it robust against future claims without stripping the women who depend on it bare before strangers." "That is not always possible." "Then discover a better legal imagination," said Anne. I saw Pike hear the sentence measure its speaker, and understand that the family alignment he had long relied upon had been altered beyond immediate repair. He bowed. "Very well." Lord Westmore added, "Mrs. Vale will sit in while you draft." Pike's eyes came to meet away again. That, more than any apology, was restoration. Not sentimental. Functionact. "I think," I said, "because someone had to. That first Mrs. Bryce should have the reserve cabinet sealed and inventoried in duplicate before the house begins to eat its own afternoon." Mrs. Bryce said, "Already done." Of course it was. I looked at her and almost smiled. Mr. Hale, who had remained silent through the boom withdrawal in the prudent manner of clergymen who know when providence is already being performed by other hands, cleared his throat. "My lord," he said, "there is one further practical matter." Lord Westmore turned to him. "The child," said Mr. Hale. "If the support is to be regularized, she must be moved soon from the posture of tolerated concealment into one of acknowledged provision. Quietly, yes, but upward, as the Countess wrote. Otherwise the trust becomes only a cleaner version of the same half-justice." There, another good sentence. Lord Westmore nodded once. "Agreed." "And where," said Anne, "is upward?" No one answered immediately. Then Lord Westmore looked at me. Not because he wished to make the decision mine. Because by now he had learned that where women and girls are concerned, The first honest answer in a room often does not come from the titled man unless he knows enough to wait, I said. Not here under the same roof and not in the same village under the same whisper. Somewhere with schooling distance and a story less degrading than dependence, Anne said. Not a school that smells of charity. Then we shall find one. The word landed beautifully, and because the room had earned one clean moment after all the bad ones, Lord Westmere said, yes. Only that. Yes to the trust to the sale. Yes to the changed order of harm. Yes to his sister as ally. Yes, perhaps, to the fact that Hartcombe would survive more truth than its fathers had thought possible. I looked at him then and knew, with the tired certainty that sometimes replaces feeling before one has time to dress it, that the day had crossed the last necessary threshold. The house had chosen the cost. Now it only remained to pay it. We began paying before the candles were lit. Not in full. That would have been fantasy. But in the only way houses ever truly pay, by converting cherished objects into cash, concealed habit into record, and private injury into an account no longer permitted to masquerade as elegance. Mr. Pike drafted for 3 hours with the expression of a man swallowing medicine he considered beneath his station. Mr. Hale witnessed every line that touched continuity of support. Mrs. Bryce sent down from the reserve cabinet an exact inventory in duplicate, one for the estate papers and one for the London sale agent, and added in a note of her own that the marble table in the West Saloon had cracked one servant's shin in every generation since my lady's mother and would not be mourned by the kitchen. Anne inserted that note into the sale packet without amendment. By 4 o'clock the trust existed. Not beautifully, not sentimentally. Legally. Miriam Larkin's support no longer traveled by rector and apothecary under initials and lowered eyes. Lucy's schooling was written plainly into the instrument, along with provision for lodging in Bakewell with Mrs. Fenton, a widow who kept a respectable house and took girls with serious minds more readily than polished accomplishments. The old route was not merely replaced, it was ended in principle. That mattered to me more than the figures did. The silver remained silver, the table remained marble, the claret remained claret. Yet once their sale had been set down in ink, they had already ceased to be family dignity and become means. I liked them better in that condition. The Beaumonts sent their note short after 5. Mrs. Beaumont expressed gratitude for the family's candor, concern for recent disturbances, and the wish that further acquaintance might be deferred until conditions at Hartcombe were more settled. Mr. Beaumont added 3 lines in his own hand beneath his mother's polished refusal. He thanked Anne for her honesty, said that he did not yet know whether he admired it wisely but admired it all the same, and asked leave to write when the house had caught its breath. Anne read the note in the blue saloon and snorted softly at the maternal portion. Then she folded the page over so that only the son's lines showed and said, "He may write. He sounds less upholstered in his own hand." That was, from Anne, nearly encouragement. By 6, the marble table had been measured, the green traveling coach valued, the greys listed, and one absurd horticultural subscription cancelled with a severity that suggested the family had been waiting years for a proper excuse. Hartcombe was not mended. It was only no longer lying quite so hard about itself. Twilight had begun by the time the last of the legal copies were sanded and stacked. Mr. Pike departed with his mouth set in the line of a man who has done his duty, disliked its moral shape, and will likely attempt to improve it through wording later if no one watches him closely enough. Mr. Hale went back to the rectory with the trust abstract in his case and a promise to fetch Mrs. Fenton in person on the morrow. Anne disappeared upstairs to change for dinner, and, before she went, squeezed my hand once without looking at me and said, "Do not let my brother become noble in solitude. It worsens him." Then she left me in the morning room with the Countess's papers, the quiet, and Lord Westmere. No, not Lord Westmere. Kit. Not because I had yet the right to think it freely. Because the room had altered too much in a day to go on calling him by the title every time my mind turned. He stood at the window with the evening ledger in one hand and the reserve inventory in the other, reading the two against each other while the last of the light thinned over the lawns. His coat had been replaced, his neckcloth retied, his hair made orderly again for dinner below stairs if dinner was still a concept anyone under this roof believed in. Yet no amount of order put back what the day had taken. He looked less like a gentleman restored than a man who had discovered which inheritance was his and intended to carry it without gentility if gentility proved too weak for the weight. I was tired enough to tell the truth more plainly than wisdom recommends. "If you keep standing there," I said, "the window will begin charging rent." He looked up. For an instant I thought the line had missed him. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not into amusement exactly, but into something easier than pain. "I should pay it," he said. "I have spent most of the day making the house pay everyone else." "That is not the same thing." No, he set down both papers. "It is not." The room had been put in order again after the day's labor. not fully. One could not restore innocence by stacking letters. Still, the Japan box was shut, the annuity volume closed, the trust copy tied. The Countess's hand no longer lay flayed across every surface. She had become archive again, which is not absolution but at least a form of quiet. He came to the desk and drew out a single folded sheet. Not a letter. Terms. I knew it by the look before he handed it to me. What is this? An offer, he said. Written while Pike was being useful under supervision. I took the page and opened it. The handwriting was not his. Pike's clerk perhaps. Or Pike's own before revision had made him elegant again. Yet the content was too exact in its bluntness to belong to the solicitor's instincts. Mrs. Eleanor Vale is invited to act as records and disbursement steward for Hartcombe on an independent paid basis for an initial term of 6 months, renewable only with her written agreement. Duties to include a review and ordering of household, reserve, charitable, and estate overlap papers, oversight of the newly established trust disbursement route, preparation of transparent duplicate ledgers for future estate use, advisory review before any sale touching historical obligations. Below that came the salary. It was enough, not lavish. Better. Enough to be clean. Then, beneath it, a line that made my throat tighten before I had decided whether it was anger or gratitude or some more inconvenient element made out of both. Residence to be offered, if she chooses, at the dower lodge beyond the kitchen garden, separate from the main house and not contingent upon personal favor. If she declines residence, full stipend remains unchanged. I read that line twice. Then once more. A great many men will offer protection when what they mean is proximity. A smaller number will offer employment when what they mean is obedience dressed in ink. Very few remember that a woman must be given a place from which refusal remains physically possible or the whole arrangement rots at once. He had remembered. I lowered the page. I dictated the terms. To Pike. To his clerk. Pike would have improved the tone beyond usefulness. I nearly smiled at that. Nearly. This is independence, I said. Deliberate independence. Why? He looked at me steadily. Because if you stayed under this roof on my invitation alone, the house would make its own employment of the fact. Because if you work without pay, I should be using your conscience like free labor. Because if your lodging depended on my regard, I would mistrust every answer you gave me afterward. And because you were right this morning, I held the paper a little tighter. About what? That men trust the language of money first. His mouth changed fractionally. I am trying to learn a more exact dialect, not sentiment, not apology. The stubborn hard thing in me that had kept itself rigid through dinner. Keys dawn, and trust found no use in resisting that sentence and finding none, gave way by half an inch, which was enough to be dangerous. I set the terms carefully on the desk, and if I refuse, the trust remains. The sale list stamp proceeds, and remains armed. Pike remains watched. He paused. Hartcombe worsens. That last line was drier than the rest, and because of that, kinder. I said, you assume a good deal of my efficiency. I have evidence. That is unfortunate for me. It is convenient for the estate. I looked down at the offer again. 6 months. The dower lodge. Independent paid basis. Not contingent upon personal favor. I thought of Lucy's inked finger on the copybook. Of Miriam's face when I said not if I can help it. Of Anne standing in the blue saloon and refusing to be priced under false accounts. Of Mrs. Bryce inventorying the reserve cabinet as if the house itself had decided at last to stop shielding weaker men with stronger Polish. Then of myself. A widow with a serviceable hand and a poor opinion of pity. A woman who had once copied other people's secrecy for money and now stood being offered money to undo it in one particular house until the line held. It was, in its own severe way, a good offer. I folded the paper. I accept the employment, I said. He did not move at once. Not from surprise, I thought. From the effort of not letting relief alter him too visibly. That is wise, he said at last. That brought from him a true brief smile, tired and real enough to change his whole face before it was gone again. Then I added, because if one means to keep clean accounts, one must begin promptly. On one further condition. Got there it was. The thing in him that had learned today not to fear women's conditions by default. What condition? That Mrs. Fenton's rooms for Lucy are seen and approved before the child is moved there, and that Miriam's own place in the arrangement be written as choice rather than disposal. No one is to improve our accounts by behaving as though we have solved womanhood through lodging. He nodded at once. Don't. That was very fast. I have been under your instruction all day. As it improved you. Intermittently. The evening deepened at the windows. Somewhere below stairs the first bell for dressing rang. Hartcombe, having spent the day dragging its conscience into legal existence, now expected everyone to wash and sit down to soup as if the sequence of civilization had not been badly interrupted by morality. Great houses are magnificent hypocrites in matters of meal. I should have left then. The offer had been made, accepted. The practical line stood. Instead, neither of us moved. He looked at the folded terms in my hand, then back to my face. There is one further matter, he said. Of course there was. I waited. He did not rush it. That too I noticed. When I asked you to stay this morning, he said, it was for the house and the work. When I asked this, his glance went to the folded terms. I asked it on the same ground. I would rather you knew that before anything else is said. My pulse altered by a degree. Anything else? The room had grown so quiet that I could hear the slight cooling click of the fire, and beyond the window, one bird still attempting to insist on spring from the wet black branches near the south lawn. He came no nearer. Good, better, worse. I will not have your livelihood tied to my regard, he said, nor your answer on one matter confused by the other. There are sentences which clear a path so thoroughly one is left with nowhere to stand but the truth. He went on, when 6 months have passed or sooner, if you prefer a shorter injury, I should like the right to ask whether your refusal of me remains as exact as your judgment in other areas. I looked at him. No flourish. No declarish. No talk of love as if love had not spent all day learning the household accounts. Only that, the right to ask, future tense, after independence first. It was, I thought wildly and with some irritation, the most decent courtship line I had ever heard, and therefore far more dangerous than poetry. You assume, I said, because something sharper than softness was all that kept me steady. That refusal is my natural posture. He answered without offense. You have made it look extremely well-founded. That nearly undid me. Not because it was charming, because it was true and not self-pitying. I set the folded terms back on the desk before I did something foolish like hold them to my chest as if paper were a shield. I do not know, I said carefully, what my answer would be in 6 months. No, he said. Neither do I. That is an impractical basis for hope, and hope is expensive. His gaze did not leave mine. Then let it be borne privately until the quarter ends. That there. Again, no theft from my wage, no theft from my choice, no demand for immediate sweetness as payment for decency. It left me with less defense than any grander speech would have done. I said, after a moment too long, you may ask. Not. The line between his brows changed, not vanished, softened. A man should perhaps not look more moved by permission than by triumph. It made him more trustworthy and therefore more hazardous. Thank you, he said. No, I replied. Do not begin there. I have not said yes. Good. He inclined his head. Then, because the room was already too full of things neither of us had yet the wisdom to name directly, and because there are moments when one may either speak foolishly or act with care, not to seize mine, not to command, only held it there, as one might at the sight of a carriage step or a difficult threshold. I looked at it, then placed my fingers in his. Steady, no more than that for 1 second. Then he drew me one measured step nearer, enough that if I had wished, I might have pulled away without even troubling the carpet. His free hand came up, not to my waist, not possessively, only to the side of my face where the day's loose tendrils of hair had escaped my pins and made me look, I imagine, more tired and more myself than was prudent in an earl's morning room. He waited. That was the final decency. Why, I said. Only then did he kiss me. No spectacle, no collapse, only one deliberate kiss in a room still smelling faintly of wax, ink, and finished labor. It was gentler than the day had taught me to expect and more exact than gentleness often is. Not the kiss of a man collecting reward. The kiss of a man entering an agreement he means to honor and discovering, to his private alarm, that the honor itself is pleasure. When he drew back, I stayed where I was for one absurd second longer than dignity liked. Then I stepped away first. Again that saved us. Below stairs the bell rang a second time. He looked toward the door and then back at me, half wary, half amused, wholly altered from the man who had entered the morning room 2 days before and demanded speed from untidy death. Dinner, he said. Will you come down? As records and disbursement steward, if you prefer. And if I prefer not to spend my first hour of employment being inspected by every spoon in the house. The Dower Lodge keys may be fetched after soup. That was better. I shall eat in my chamber tonight, I said. Tomorrow the house may stare at me under my new title if it has the stamina. A sensible policy. I improve under independence. So I hope. I picked up the folded terms in the morning room key. He did not offer the larger ring again and I did not ask. 1 key was enough for now. Enough truth. Enough work. Enough future to make the present bearable. At the door I paused. He was standing by the desk again, one hand resting near the tied trust copies, the other over the Countess's final memorandum. The room behind him looked no prettier than it had that morning, only more honest. Kit, I said. It was the first time I had spoken the name aloud. He looked up. Do not let Pike sell the claret too cheaply. Something in his face gave way fully then, not into laughter, not quite, but into the kind of happiness a tired man mistrusts and cannot entirely conceal. I shall guard the cellar with my life. Do that, I said. It is the first sensible vow any Westmer has made in these papers. I left him with that. In the corridor the house had begun its evening motions in earnest. A maid hurried past with warmed plates. Thomas carried candles toward the stair. Somewhere Anne was almost certainly deciding whether Mr. Beaumont's note deserved an answer before Thursday or punishment first. Hartcombe was still expensive, still burdened, still damp at the roots and morally overdue in several directions. The marble table was not yet sold. Lucy was not yet moved. Mary had not yet seen the trust copy. The Beaumont connection might yet fail. The village would certainly talk. Good, let it talk over facts rather than shadows for once. I went to my chamber, where my traveling case still stood packed by the wall. I unpacked it slowly, one gown at a time.